I'm a night shift ER nurse, and after 12 years in this job, I thought I was hardened to pretty much everything. The stories we see and hear, they wear on you, but you learn to leave it behind, or at least pretend to. I've been there for everything from violent trauma cases to the quiet, heartbreaking moments where you realize you're too late. I'd gotten used to it, or at least I thought I had. But one night about 6 months ago, there was a patient who left a mark I can't seem to shake. It was about 2:30 in the morning, that strange quiet lull we sometimes get in the ER when the usual rush dies down. I was catching up on charts when a young woman walked in. She was in her 20s, dressed in a baggy sweater and jeans, hair tied back. At first, she looked calm, almost out of place in the ER, but as she got closer, I noticed her hands shaking. She clutched her arm, pressing it to her chest as if holding herself together. When she reached the desk, she glanced around nervously, her eyes darting to the security guard, the doors, the cameras, and finally to me. She leaned in, voice barely a whisper, and said, "I need to see a doctor. But can I wait somewhere private?" There was a desperation in her voice, the kind of fear you don't normally see unless something's gone horribly wrong. I took her to a private exam room, trying to keep her calm. She winced as she sat down, carefully avoiding putting pressure on her left side. When I asked what was wrong, she looked at me with wide, hollow eyes, like she was measuring how much to trust me. I think someone's following me," she whispered. "But I can't go to the police. They wouldn't understand. Normally, we try to focus on immediate medical issues, not whatever backstory patients bring with them." But something in her expression, the haunted look in her eyes, made me pause. I asked her what happened, if she was injured, if she needed help. She hesitated, her gaze distant, and then slowly lifted her sleeve. Her arm was covered in bruises, a pattern of fresh and fading marks, like someone had grabbed her with incredible force. There were deep scratches on her forearm, thin lines crossing over each other in a way that looked intentional. I felt a chill, but I stayed calm, asking her if she'd been in an accident or if someone had hurt her. She shook her head, clutching her arm closer. "They're not from someone else," she said, voice wavering. "They're from me. I did this, but I don't remember doing it." I sat down, leaning in to listen. She started talking, words spilling out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back for too long. She told me she'd been having blackouts for weeks. One minute she'd be fine, going about her day, and the next she'd find herself somewhere else, her hands bloodied, her arms scratched, like she'd been in a fight she couldn't remember. She glanced over her shoulder, her face pale, and whispered, I think something's inside me." My mind immediately went to dissociative disorders, maybe severe PTSD. But there was something about her fear that was different, like she wasn't just afraid of herself, but of something bigger, something she couldn't even explain. As I checked her vitals, her heart rate was racing, and her breathing was shallow. She was physically fine, but her body was clearly in full-blown panic. I tried to reassure her, telling her we'd get her some help, maybe have a psych consult. But she grabbed my hand, her grip icy and tight, and said, "Please, don't let me fall asleep. That's when it happens. That's when I lose control." I could tell she was exhausted, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, maybe weeks. I offered to get her something to calm her nerves, to help her talk through what was happening, but she shook her head, eyes widening. No sedatives. If I fall asleep, I don't know who I'll be when I wake up." I stayed with her as long as I could, letting her talk, trying to ease her fear. She told me about the blackouts, how they were getting longer, how she'd wake up in strange places, her clothes torn, her skin scratched and bruised. She said she'd see flashes of herself in the mirror sometimes, only it wasn't really her. It was her face, but wrong, twisted with anger she didn't recognize. She said it felt like she was being pushed aside, forced out of her own body by something that wanted to take over. I've dealt with patients suffering from all kinds of psychosis. People who see things that aren't there, hear voices no one else can hear. But there was something about her story, something in her tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She wasn't just confused or paranoid. She was terrified, like she was fighting a battle no one else could see. Eventually, I had to step out to get one of the doctors to sign off on her admission for observation. I left her in the room, telling her I'd be back soon, that we'd keep her safe. But as I was walking down the hall, I heard a crash from behind me. I turned back, my heart racing, and found her standing in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, her face pale as death. "I can't stay here," she whispered almost to herself. Her eyes were unfocused, like she was staring at something far away. I tried to calm her, to guide her back to the bed, but she pulled away, her hands trembling. "You don't understand. It's in me. I can feel it watching, waiting." Before I could stop her, she bolted down the hall, pushing past nurses and security. I chased after her, but she was fast, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. By the time I reached the lobby, she was gone, vanished into the night. The hospital filed a report, notified the police, but they didn't find her. It was like she disappeared completely. Days turned into weeks, and eventually, the memory of that night faded, replaced by new patients, new crises. But every once in a while, I'd think of her, wondering if she'd found help, if she'd finally gotten away from whatever had haunted her. Then, about a month later, I was working another late shift when a patient came in, another young woman, close to the same age, with similar bruises, similar scratches. As I approached her bed, she looked up at me with the same hollow, haunted eyes and whispered, "Please, don't let me fall asleep." My buddy Ryan had been working toward a promotion for almost a year, putting in extra hours, handling extra projects, and jumping through every hoop his manager threw at him. He was the kind of guy who really believed in loyalty, thought that hard work would eventually pay off. But last month, when the promotion finally came up, they gave it to someone else, someone who'd only been there a few months. The reason? Fresh perspective. Ryan was gutted, staring at his coffee with a hollow "look the day," he told me. "Feels like I gave them everything," he said, barely holding back his frustration. And they just wanted someone new to shake things up. That same week, my friend Sophie got caught up in yet another ticket-buying fiasco. She'd been saving up to take her little sister to a concert, an artist they'd both been obsessed with since high school. When the tickets went on sale, she was ready, card in hand, refreshing her screen like her life depended on it. But it was déjà vu. The tickets were gone in seconds. Later, she found them on a resale site at 4 times the price. "It's like they're selling memories to the highest bidder," she muttered, showing me the ridiculous prices on her phone. "I just wanted to make my sister's night, but now it's out of reach." The next evening, a group of us met up at a bar to catch up and blow off some steam. Ryan was still simmering over the job, and Sophie was venting about the ticket situation. As we shared our stories, another friend, Max, joined us. He works as an analyst, and lately he'd been feeling uneasy about how much data they were collecting on people. "You'd be shocked at the stuff we track," he said, leaning in like he was telling a ghost story. "We know people's locations, their online habits, what time they go to sleep, even." He shook his head. "And the worst part? We're selling it. All of it. It's just another product to these companies." We all looked at each other, unease settling in. The apps we used every day were like silent spies in our pockets, and we hadn't thought twice about it. As the night went on, Sophie showed us a news headline on her phone about politicians trading stocks based on insider information. Apparently, they dumped certain shares right before some big legislation hit, saving themselves millions while the rest of the market took a dive. "So it's illegal for us, but fine for them?" Sophie said, her voice laced with disbelief. "They're supposed to work for us, and they're just padding their own bank accounts." We all felt the sting of it. How the people who had the power to actually make things fair were only using that power to protect themselves. Then, as if to top it off, the TV above the bar played a flashy gambling ad. A group of people were laughing, holding up stacks of cash like hitting it big was something anyone could do. Sophie scoffed, rolling her eyes. "It's everywhere now," she said, telling us about a friend who'd gotten hooked on online betting. It started as a harmless distraction, something to pass the time, but it quickly spiraled. Now he was deep in debt, unable to quit. They banned cigarette ads for a reason, but this? They're practically begging people to throw their lives away. By the time we left the bar, it felt like the whole world was a giant rigged game, designed to squeeze everything out of us and leave us with nothing. As we walked down the street, a police car pulled up and started questioning a couple of people outside a store, checking IDs and asking where they'd been. We kept our heads down and passed by, but it left a sour taste. Ryan shook his head, muttering, "Feels like they're always watching us, but the ones who need watching just keep getting away with everything." That night, we all went home feeling like pieces on someone else's chessboard. Our moves limited, our chances sold to the highest bidder. Sophie looked back at us as we said our goodbyes and said, "It's like nothing's real anymore. The jobs, the concerts, the ads, it's all just smoke and mirrors." And as we stood there in the dim streetlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. I was sitting alone at a small diner, just off the highway, somewhere between my last job and my next one, when she walked in. The place was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that only happens in the dead of night. I was nursing a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the rain blurring the neon sign outside, when I heard the bell over the door. I glanced over and saw her, a woman in her 60s, drenched from the rain, her clothes clinging to her like she'd walked for miles. She wore an oversized, threadbare coat, and her eyes had that look, the one that says she's been searching for something a long time and isn't sure if she's close to finding it or ready to give up. She looked around the diner, then made her way to the counter, sitting a few stools down from me. The waitress came over, her tired smile polite but a little wary, like she'd seen her share of midnight drifters. "Just coffee," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at her hands, which were clasped around a small, weathered box she held in her lap. It looked like an old jewelry box, the kind you'd find at a thrift store, and her fingers drummed absently on its lid. For reasons I couldn't explain, I was drawn to her like there was some invisible thread connecting us. Normally, I kept to myself, especially on nights like this. But there was something about her that made me want to know more. So, against my better judgment, I slid over to the stool beside hers and gave her a nod. "Rough night for a walk," I said, nodding toward her soaked clothes. She looked over at me, her eyes sharp but tired. "More like a rough life," she replied, her lips quirking up in a faint, humorless smile. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the old fluorescent lights and the clinking of dishes the only sounds in the diner. Finally, I nodded toward the box in her lap. "Got something special in there?" I asked, more to fill the quiet than anything else. Her fingers tightened around it, and she glanced down, as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. "Depends who you ask, I suppose." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She took a long sip of her coffee, then set the mug down, her eyes distant. "This box, it's been in my family for generations. My grandmother used to say it was cursed, but my mother said it was a blessing. I don't know what to think." My curiosity piqued. "What's inside?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edges of the lid. "I'm not sure. None of us ever opened it." Now she really had my attention. "You've had it all this time and never opened it? Why not?" She looked at me with a wry smile. "Every time someone's tried, something strange has happened. My grandmother tried once, and the key snapped in the lock. My mother tried, and she swore she heard voices. Me, I've always figured some things are better left a mystery." She glanced out the window, her gaze far away. "But lately, I've started wondering if maybe it's time. Maybe whatever's in here, maybe it was meant for me to see." I could tell she was debating something in her mind, wrestling with an old fear and a new curiosity. I was about to say something, offer to help her open it, maybe, but before I could, she turned to me and asked a question that felt like a challenge. "Do you believe in fate?" I paused, taken aback. "Fate?" I echoed, thinking it over. "I don't know. I guess I believe that some things happen for a reason, even if we don't understand it." She nodded, as if that was the answer she'd expected. Then, with a steady hand, she lifted the box and set it on the counter between us. "I think maybe you were meant to be here," she said quietly. "Maybe you're supposed to help me open it." I blinked, surprised. "Me?" She nodded, her eyes locked on mine. "I don't know why, but I have this feeling, like tonight is the night, and you're supposed to be here." Something in her gaze made me feel like I couldn't say no, like I was already part of whatever story had led her to this moment. I took a deep breath and reached out, my hand hovering over the box. She handed it to me, and I felt a strange thrill, a mix of fear and excitement, as I gripped it. The lock was an old, simple one, the kind that should have been easy to open. I pulled a paperclip from my pocket, bending it to fit into the lock. I worked at it for a few moments, feeling the small, subtle clicks of the tumblers inside. And then, with a soft pop, the lock gave. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, as if she couldn't believe it. Slowly, reverently, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of velvet, was a single, faded envelope. She stared at it, her hands trembling, and then, with a deep breath, she lifted it out and opened it. I watched as she unfolded the old paper, her eyes scanning the words. As she read, tears filled her eyes, spilling over silently, her lips forming the faintest of smiles. "What does it say?" I asked softly, feeling like I was intruding on something deeply personal. She looked up at me, and for the first time, her face softened, her expression full of something I could only describe as peace. "It's a letter from my grandmother," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She wrote it for me before she died, for me to read when I was ready." She held up the letter, glancing over it again. She talks about how life is full of secrets, how sometimes we're meant to wait until the right moment to understand certain things. She says I'll never be alone, that I'll always have a family looking out for me, even if they're not here. I nodded, my throat tight. It sounds like she knew what she was doing. The woman smiled, the sadness in her eyes replaced with something softer, lighter. "She did," she whispered. "All this time, I thought the box was some mystery, something to fear. But it was just waiting for the right moment." We sat in silence for a long time, letting the moment settle around us, the quiet weight of the letter lingering between us. When she finally folded it back into the envelope and placed it in her coat pocket, she looked at me with a gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you," she murmured, "for being here tonight." I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded. "Anytime," I replied, and somehow I meant it. She left a few minutes later, slipping out into the rain with a lighter step than when she'd arrived. I watched her go, feeling like I'd just been part of something rare, something that went beyond coincidence. As the bell above the door jingled behind her, I realized that maybe fate really was at work sometimes, weaving people together in small, quiet ways. And as I sat there, the last customer in the diner, I felt a strange peace settle over me, like I'd been given a gift without even knowing it. For the first time in a long time, I felt that maybe, just maybe, we're all a little connected. I don't know how to explain what happened last winter, and I'm not sure anyone will believe me, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. I was just an ordinary delivery driver for a small courier company, the kind of job where you drive around town dropping off packages and envelopes. It was mostly uneventful, long hours, lots of coffee, and a steady stream of addresses to plug into the GPS. I've been doing it for a while and thought I'd seen it all, but then I got assigned a route in a part of town I didn't usually go to. This place was on the edge of the city, right where the neighborhood started thinning out into stretches of fields and empty roads. My GPS told me to turn down a dirt road, winding through a stretch of trees that seemed to close in on either side. It was one of those cloudy winter days where the light feels strange, almost too dim, even though it's the middle of the afternoon. I followed the road until I reached the house at the end, a small, weather-beaten place that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Paint was peeling off the walls, the windows were dark and lifeless, and the whole place had this feeling of abandonment that made me uneasy. There was no car in the driveway, no sign of life anywhere. But I had a job to do, so I grabbed the package, a small, square box with no return address, and made my way to the door. I knocked a couple of times, but there was no answer. I was about to leave the package on the porch when I heard something from inside. A faint shuffling, like someone moving slowly across the floor. I knocked again, a little louder this time, calling out, "Delivery!" The shuffling stopped, and there was this long silence, thick and uncomfortable. I was about to turn around and leave when I heard the door's lock click. The door swung open just a few inches, enough for me to see a pale, thin face staring back at me through the gap. The person was an older man, maybe in his 70s, with deep lines carved into his face and these piercing, glassy eyes that made my skin crawl. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with this expression that was somewhere between confusion and anger, maybe. "I have a delivery for you," I said, holding up the package. The man's eyes flicked down to the box, and his expression changed slightly. It was like he recognized it, but not in a good way. He didn't reach out to take it, just kept staring, like he was weighing something in his mind. "Just leave it there," he finally muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I set the package down on the porch and turned to leave, but as I did, I felt a hand grip my arm, bony and ice cold. I looked back, startled, and found him staring at me with this desperate look in his eyes. "You saw who brought this, right?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Tell me you saw who brought this." No, sir," I stammered, completely thrown off. "I'm just the delivery guy. I don't know who sent it." His face fell, and he let go of my arm, his hand shaking as he withdrew it. He mumbled something under his breath, something I couldn't catch, and then he shut the door without another word. I went back to my truck, feeling like I just stepped out of some kind of weird dream. The interaction was unsettling, but I had more stops to make, so I pushed it out of my mind and moved on. But that night, as I was falling asleep, I couldn't shake the memory of that man's face, his eyes wide and afraid, his voice shaking as he asked if I'd seen who'd sent the package. A few days later, I got assigned to the same route. My heart sank when I saw the address pop up again. Apparently, there was another package for the same house. When I arrived, the place looked the same, dark, lifeless, and unsettlingly quiet. The same package size, no return address, just like before. I walked up to the porch, half expecting the man to answer, but this time, there was no sound from inside. I knocked, but no one came. After waiting for a few minutes, I left the package on the doorstep and headed back to my truck. But as I turned onto the main road, I saw something in my rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing in the driveway, just barely visible in the distance, watching me drive away. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it had to be him. He just stood there, still and silent, staring as I disappeared down the road. After that, I didn't hear anything about the man or the packages for a few weeks. I figured he'd either stopped ordering things, or maybe they'd assigned someone else to that route. But then one night, I was doing my last few deliveries when I saw the address pop up again. The same house, the same name. My stomach twisted, and I almost considered asking my boss to reassign it, but I didn't want to look weak. So I drove out there, telling myself it was just another delivery, just a job. When I got there, the house looked different. The front door was wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. The porch light was off, and there was a strange smell in the air, something sour and metallic that made me gag. I stepped out of the truck, calling out, "Hello? Delivery," but there was no answer. The whole place was silent, almost oppressively so, like the air was thick with something I couldn't see. I didn't want to go inside, but something compelled me to check. Maybe it was worry. Maybe it was curiosity. I don't know. But I walked up the porch steps, peered into the house, and called out again. Nothing. I took a cautious step inside, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. The package, the one I'd delivered just weeks ago, was lying on the floor, ripped open, its contents scattered. In the dim light, I could make out what looked like old, faded photographs, each one showing the same man, the same house, the same empty, lifeless rooms. But there was something else too. Scrawled across the photos in thick, black ink were words. Desperate, frantic words like "help me" and "don't let him in." I stumbled back, feeling dizzy, and then I heard a faint shuffling sound coming from somewhere deeper in the house. It was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted out of there, jumped into my truck, and sped down that dirt road as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The next morning, I went straight to my boss and told him I wouldn't be delivering to that house anymore. I didn't explain why, just said it wasn't safe, that there was something wrong with the place. He looked at me like I was crazy, but agreed to take me off the route. I quit the job not long after that, moved to a new city, and tried to put it all behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that man, about the look in his eyes when he asked if I'd seen who sent the package. And every time I do, I feel a chill run down my spine, because I know that whatever was haunting that house, whatever he was afraid of, it's still out there. And some nights, when I'm alone in the dark, I wonder if maybe it followed me. My friend Jenna had been gearing up for her dream job interview for weeks. She'd done her research, practiced with mock interviews, even bought a new suit just for the occasion. The role was perfect for her, and she was perfect for it. She went through 4 rounds of interviews, and each one seemed to go better than the last. They kept telling her she was a top candidate, that they were excited to move forward. She'd already started imagining herself in the role, planning what she'd do her first week. But then, after weeks of anticipation, she got a cold, generic email. "Thank you for your interest, but we have decided to pursue other candidates." No explanation, no feedback, just a door slamming shut. "It's like I was a placeholder until they found someone better," she said, crushed. All that work, and they couldn't even give me the courtesy of a real goodbye. That same week, my cousin Liam was trying to buy tickets to his favorite band's reunion concert. He'd been a fan since he was a teenager, and this was supposed to be a big deal for him, a chance to relive some of those old memories. But just like that, the tickets were gone within minutes. They popped up on resale sites almost immediately, marked up to prices only the insanely wealthy would even consider. Liam sent me a screenshot of the resale page, shaking his head. "How is this even legal?" he wrote. "It's like they're selling nostalgia by the pound, and only millionaires can afford it." That weekend, a group of us got together to decompress. Jenna was still smarting from the rejection, and Liam was venting about the ticket fiasco. As we swapped stories, our friend Oliver joined in. He works in cybersecurity, and he'd been having a rough week himself. "You'd be shocked at how much data they're gathering on everyone," he said, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "I'm talking about everything. Your location, your shopping habits, even what you pause to look at for longer than a second." He shook his head, his voice tinged with frustration. "And they're not just keeping it. They're selling it to anyone with cash. Privacy? That ship sailed a long time ago." We sat there in stunned silence for a moment, each of us looking at our phones with a new sense of unease. The gadgets that had become extensions of ourselves were really just portals for companies to peer into our lives, selling every glance, every click to the highest bidder. I felt a shiver run down my spine, realizing just how much of my life wasn't mine anymore. And then, as if we needed more to be disillusioned about, a news alert popped up on Liam's phone about another politician involved in an insider trading scandal. Apparently, they dumped stock right before a major company took a nosedive, avoiding millions in losses. We all exchanged glances, each of us feeling the same bitter realization. "So, they get a free pass to do what would get the rest of us arrested?" Jenna said, crossing her arms. "They're supposed to work for us, but they're just using their power to make sure they're safe when things go south." It felt like the rules were written for people like us, while the powerful just bent them whenever it suited them. On our way out, we passed by a wall covered with ads, one of them for a gambling app. It showed some guy, fist-pumping, practically glowing with excitement, as if gambling had just made all his dreams come true. "It's everywhere now," Liam muttered, shaking his head. He told us about a friend who'd started online betting just for fun, but now was in serious debt, struggling to pull himself out. "They make it look like a game, but it's just another way to pull people in and take what little they have." As we said our goodbyes that night, Jenna turned to me, her face tired but thoughtful. "Everything feels like it's set up against us," she said quietly. "Jobs, tickets, data, even our own rights. They take whatever they can, and we're just supposed to be okay with it." I didn't have an answer, but as I walked home, her words echoed in my mind, a reminder of how the world seemed to be slipping further and further from anything that felt real or fake. The letter arrived on my birthday, sealed with a wax stamp I recognized immediately, a star within a circle. It was a symbol I hadn't seen in years, not since my grandfather passed. He'd used that symbol on everything he owned, claiming it was his signature of adventure. Growing up, he'd filled my head with stories about strange journeys and hidden places, the kinds of tales that make you look at the world a little differently. I always thought he'd made them up, just the wild stories of a man who wanted to keep his grandson entertained. But now, seeing that symbol again, my heart skipped a beat. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His handwriting, still so familiar, filled the page in neat, elegant lines. "Happy birthday, James. I hope this letter finds you as curious as ever. If you're reading this, it means I've passed, and you've reached the age I always believed was special. You're ready for your own adventure." I paused, feeling a strange mix of excitement and disbelief. The letter went on. In the old trunk in the attic, you'll find a map. It's a bit worn and might seem strange, but trust me, it's real. Follow it, and you'll find the place I told you about. The one you always thought was just a story. I left something there for you. I read and reread the letter, my mind spinning. The place he told me about, he used to call it the Lantern Room, a place tucked away somewhere in the woods. Supposedly, it was where he'd gone to reflect, to think, and where he claimed he'd found a little magic. I dismissed it as another one of his tall tales, a fantasy he spun out of boredom. But now, the possibility that it could be real was right in front of me. I didn't think twice. That evening, I climbed into the attic, navigating through the dust and the quiet shadows of the things he'd left behind. The trunk was right where I remembered it, heavy and solid. I flipped open the lid, digging through old sweaters, trinkets, and faded photographs until my fingers touched something brittle. A map. I unfolded it carefully. The paper was yellowed with age, but the lines and markings were clear. The path wound through a forest I recognized, not far from where he'd lived. At the center of the map, in bold, dark ink, were the words "The Lantern Room," with a small symbol of a star and circle drawn beside it. The next morning, I packed a bag, grabbed the map, and drove out to the edge of the forest. It was early, the light barely cutting through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The woods felt both familiar and foreign, filled with sounds that were at once comforting and eerie. Following the map was surprisingly easy, as if my grandfather had anticipated my every step. I crossed a narrow stream, climbed a hill lined with rocks, and finally found myself standing at the edge of a small clearing. In the center stood an old stone cabin, almost hidden beneath layers of ivy and moss. A single lantern hung beside the door, swaying gently in the breeze, though it was unlit. My breath caught. The Lantern Room. I approached slowly, feeling a reverent awe wash over me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dim interior that smelled of cedar and earth. Inside, the room was sparse. Just a table, a chair, and shelves lined with books, jars, and small trinkets. But what drew my attention was the lantern sitting on the table, a note tucked beneath it. I picked up the note, recognizing my grandfather's handwriting. This lantern has a little magic left in it, if you know how to look. It's a guide, James. Light it, and it'll show you the way to places you've never been before. But only light it when you're truly ready. I stared at the lantern, my mind racing. The metal was tarnished, the glass cloudy with age. But as I held it, I felt a warmth, a subtle vibration, like something alive was sleeping inside it, waiting. For a long time, I just stood there, the weight of the lantern in my hands, the quiet of the woods surrounding me. I thought about everything he'd told me growing up, all those stories of hidden places, forgotten trails, and moments of wonder that couldn't be explained. Finally, I took a deep breath, struck a match, and touched it to the lantern's wick. The flame flickered to life, casting a warm, golden glow that filled the room, bright and strangely comforting. But then, something remarkable happened. The flame grew brighter, casting beams that stretched beyond the walls, as though the lantern were trying to illuminate something beyond this world. The light pulsed, and a warmth spread through me, filling me with a strange sense of knowing, like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The light flickered, then settled, the glow softening. I stepped outside, lantern in hand, and saw that it cast a path through the forest, a faint, golden trail winding between the trees. I followed it, my heart pounding with excitement and a hint of fear. The trail led me deeper into the woods, through thickets and past towering oaks, until I reached another clearing. In the center stood a massive stone archway, covered in moss and carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The light from the lantern illuminated the archway, making the symbols glow. My hand trembled as I stepped closer, feeling an energy emanate from the stones, something ancient and powerful. There was no door, no barrier, just an open arch beckoning. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through. Instantly, the world shifted. I was still in the forest, but everything felt different. The colors were richer, the air warmer, and a gentle hum filled the space, like a distant melody. Trees that had been barren in the clearing were now in full bloom, their leaves shimmering in shades I couldn't quite place, colors that seemed to dance between green and gold. And there, at the heart of this enchanted place, was a pool of water, perfectly still and clear. At its edge sat a small wooden box with my name carved into the lid. I knelt down, opening it slowly. Inside was a journal filled with entries in my grandfather's handwriting. Each entry was a description of the places he'd discovered, places that existed just beyond the veil of the ordinary world. Places of beauty, wonder, and mystery. The final entry caught my eye, written in bold, sprawling letters. To James, my grandson, there is magic in this world, hidden in plain sight. Most people never find it, not because they aren't looking, but because they don't believe it's there. Trust the lantern, trust your heart, and keep seeking. This world is bigger, stranger, and more beautiful than you know. It's waiting for you. I closed the journal, feeling a profound peace settle over me. My grandfather hadn't just left me a map. He'd left me a legacy, a call to explore the hidden wonders of the world, to seek out the magic he'd always believed in. I stayed in that place for hours, soaking in the beauty, the peace, the feeling that I was connected to something ancient and timeless. When I finally returned to the cabin, I set the lantern back on the table, understanding that this was just the beginning of my journey. As I made my way back through the forest, the sun setting in a blaze of colors, I knew that my life would never be the same. My grandfather had given me a gift beyond measure, a glimpse of the extraordinary. And with that lantern's light still burning in my heart, I was ready to discover every hidden wonder the world had to offer. It was the first night in my new apartment, a tiny place on the third floor of an old building downtown. The kind of place with creaky floors, radiators that clang at all hours, and the faint smell of old wood that lingers in the walls. But I loved it. Small as it was mine, and I spent the day unpacking boxes, feeling proud and hopeful for a fresh start. By midnight, I was exhausted. I'd gotten most of the boxes unpacked, furniture arranged, and decided to reward myself with a hot shower and an early night. I climbed into bed, the hum of the city below drifting up through the open window, soft and comforting. As I started to drift off, I noticed a faint sound like a creaking floorboard. I assumed it was just the old building settling, told myself to relax and let sleep take over. But the sound came again and again. It was steady, almost rhythmic, a slow, dragging creak that seemed to come from somewhere just beyond my bedroom door. I sat up, heart pounding, listening as the noise grew louder, the slow groan of wood bending under weight, inching closer. Trying to calm myself, I told myself it was probably just one of my neighbors. These old buildings have thin walls, after all, and sound carries. Maybe someone upstairs was just pacing the floor, I reasoned. But something about it felt wrong. The way it moved, the heaviness of each step. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight, and slipped out of bed, heart racing as I approached my bedroom door. The hallway outside was dark, my boxes stacked along the walls in shadowy shapes. I held my breath, inching the door open, the flashlight's beam trembling as I scanned the narrow hallway. But there was nothing there, just the empty corridor, silent and still. I took a deep breath, letting the tension ease out of my shoulders, convinced I was just psyching myself out. But just as I was about to go back to bed, I heard it, a whisper, faint and raspy, coming from the far end of the hall. "Hello!" My blood ran cold, every nerve screaming as I stood frozen in place. The whisper came again, softer, almost pleading. "Is someone there?" I couldn't speak, couldn't move, only stare at the dark end of the hallway where the voice seemed to come from. It was strange, though. It sounded close, like it was right next to me, and yet I couldn't see anyone there. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me, suffocating. Then, from the shadows, I saw it, a shape just barely visible in the darkness. It was hunched indistinct, but I could make out the outline of a person, a tall, thin figure, leaning against the wall, its head tilted, as if it were listening for something. "Who's there?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me with an intensity that felt almost physical. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and hollow, piercing through the darkness. The flashlight in my hand started to flicker, the beam dimming, and a cold wave of dread washed over me. I took a step back, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. And then, without warning, the figure took a step forward, its footfall heavy, dragging, the creak of the floorboards echoing through the hallway. Another step closer, the shape growing clearer, sharper, as it moved toward me. I couldn't wait any longer. I turned and bolted back into my room, slamming the door behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. I backed up against the wall, clutching the phone, my heart racing as I tried to listen, to hear any sound from the other side of the door. Silence. I waited, barely breathing, my eyes fixed on the door, every second feeling like an eternity. And then, slowly, I heard it, a soft, scraping sound like fingernails dragging along the wood. It started at the top of the door, slowly, methodically, moving down, the noise so quiet it was almost a whisper. I pressed my back against the wall, biting down on my lip to keep from making a sound, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the scraping stopped. The silence hung thick and heavy, suffocating, and I waited, every muscle tense, waiting for the next sound. After what felt like hours, I dared to move, inching closer to the door, pressing my ear against the wood, straining to listen. Nothing. I took a shaky breath, trying to convince myself it was over, that whatever I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, was gone. Just as I pulled away from the door, I heard it again, a soft whisper, so close it felt like it was right beside me. "Hello?" I stumbled back, barely able to hold the phone steady as I stared at the door, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, trapped between fear and disbelief. And then, slowly, I saw the doorknob begin to turn. It moved with a strange, jerky motion, like someone was struggling to turn it, each movement sending a shock of terror through me. The lock held, but the knob continued to twist, rattling as if something was desperately trying to get in. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The doorknob stilled, the hallway fell silent, and I was left standing there in the dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and fear. I didn't sleep that night. I sat against the wall, clutching my phone, listening to every creak, every whisper, every imagined footstep in the dark. By morning, the hallway was empty. The doorknob was still, the air calm, and the light streaming in through the window made everything feel absurd, like it had all been a bad dream. But as I packed my things, desperate to leave, I saw it. The faint, jagged scratch marks trailing down the door from top to bottom, like the path of someone trying to claw their way in. I moved out that day, breaking the lease without a second thought, and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up, hearing that voice, soft and pleading, calling out from the darkness. "Hello!" It was a Saturday morning, and I decided to do a little home improvement. Nothing major, just installing a couple of shelves in my bedroom to hold the clutter piling up on my desk. I'd watched a few tutorials, bought the right wall anchors, and was feeling pretty confident. I measured everything carefully, drilled the holes, and started screwing the brackets into the wall. But then, as I pushed the drill a bit too far, I felt a sudden resistance, followed by a strange, quiet hissing sound. At first, I thought it was just the drill bit rubbing against something, but the sound didn't stop. It took me a few seconds to realize that I was hearing gas. My stomach dropped. Somehow, I drilled right into a gas line, hidden behind the drywall. Panic surged through me. I'd read enough horror stories to know that even a tiny gas leak could turn deadly fast. I quickly turned off the drill, but the hissing continued, faint but steady. The idea of that gas filling my room, of one spark igniting it, flashed in my mind, and I immediately backed away, hardly daring to breathe. I ran to the kitchen and turned off the main gas valve, hoping it would stop the leak, and threw open every window in the house to let the air circulate. My heart was racing as I stood by the front door, trying to stay calm, while waiting for the room to air out. I called the gas company, explaining what had happened in a voice that was shaking more than I'd like to admit. They told me to evacuate the house and wait outside for the technician to arrive. I grabbed my phone and keys, locking the door behind me, and went out to the front porch, feeling the cold morning air cool my skin and, slowly, my nerves. The technician arrived in less than half an hour, though it felt like an eternity. He was calm and reassuring, which helped me feel a little less panicked, and went in to check the damage. He confirmed what I feared. I'd pierced the gas line with my drill. "Lucky you caught it when you did," he said, his voice casual, like he dealt with this kind of thing every day. Even a small leak like that could build up enough gas in a closed room to be dangerous. A spark from your drill could have set it off. I nodded, my face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and relief. I thought back to the dozens of times I'd drilled holes for shelves, photos, hooks, things I'd hung without a second thought, trusting that nothing critical lay behind the drywall. Now, I couldn't believe I'd been so careless, assuming the wall was just a wall. After he left, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to something potentially life-threatening. I imagined what could have happened if I'd ignored that sound, if I hadn't realized it was gas, if I'd kept drilling for just a moment longer. The realization was unsettling, and for days afterward, I found myself looking at my walls with a new sense of caution, wondering what else might be hidden behind them. That experience sparked a strange shift in my mindset. I became more cautious about the little things I'd always taken for granted, the hidden systems that kept my home running smoothly, but that I rarely thought about. I started paying closer attention to everything, double-checking the stove before I left the house, inspecting the water heater in the basement, testing smoke detectors monthly instead of whenever I remembered. It was as if a layer of awareness had been peeled back, and I could see the potential hazards lurking behind the things I'd always trusted to be safe. The next time I visited my friend Dan, I noticed he had a similar shelf setup to what I'd been trying to install. I asked him if he'd ever thought about checking for pipes or wiring behind the wall before he drilled. He laughed, shaking his head, and said, "Nah man, I just eyeball it. Never had a problem." I laughed along with him, but I couldn't shake the thought that I'd almost been just as casual about it. I found myself sharing my story, and as I talked, I watched Dan's face shift from amusement to surprise to a kind of sober realization. "Man, I guess I should be more careful," he admitted, scratching his head. "Never thought about it like that." A few weeks later, Dan sent me a picture of a stud finder he'd bought, one that could detect pipes and wiring. "Better safe than sorry, right?" he'd written, and I smiled, glad that my near disaster might have prevented his own. Since then, I've been more deliberate with every project I take on. I research how to find the safest spots to drill, learn about my home's wiring and plumbing layouts, and took the time to understand the infrastructure that supported my day-to-day life. It wasn't that I wanted to live in fear. It was more that I wanted to respect the hidden complexity of the place I called home, to be aware that behind the drywall and under the floorboards, there were systems that could be as dangerous as they were essential. That day taught me that safety isn't always about what you can see. Sometimes it's about what you can't, about the pipes carrying gas and water, the wires transmitting electricity, the things that keep life running smoothly but can turn dangerous if we ignore them. Now, every time I pick up a drill or a hammer, I think about that soft hiss in the wall, the subtle but urgent reminder that not everything is as simple as it seems. And while it might seem like a small thing, that extra moment of caution feels like a small act of respect for the place that keeps me safe until and unless I give it reason not to. I don't know why I agreed to the job, but I'd been strapped for cash, and the offer came at the right time. I was hired by a cleaning service to take care of an estate sale prep on the outskirts of town, an old house that had been empty for years. The place was enormous, 3 stories with a sprawling yard that had all but swallowed the house in vines and weeds. It looked like one of those haunted houses you see in movies, with broken shutters and an air of forgotten sadness hanging over it. But the pay was good, and I figured it would be easy enough. The day I arrived, I met the owner, a thin, frail man named Mr. Charles, who had inherited the place from his late uncle. He was selling the house and wanted everything cleaned out. Furniture, books, belongings, anything left by the previous owner. "I haven't been in there much," he told me with a nervous smile. "Honestly, I'd rather not." Uncle left things behind. Just toss whatever you find. I'll pay extra if you don't ask questions. The whole setup was strange, but money's money, so I agreed. The first 2 floors were manageable, musty but filled with the usual dusty furniture, old family photos, and random junk. I boxed things up, cleared the rooms, didn't think much of it. But then I got to the attic. The attic door was tucked at the end of a narrow hallway, hidden behind an old wardrobe that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. When I finally pushed the wardrobe aside and opened the attic door, I was hit with a wave of cold, stale air and a smell I couldn't quite place, like mildew mixed with something sour, something wrong. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a single bulb that cast weak shadows over everything. Boxes lined the walls, piled up to the low, slanted ceiling, and an old, cracked mirror stood in the far corner, leaning against the wall. Something about the mirror caught my eye right away. It was too large to be shoved up in an attic like that. Too ornate, with these dark, twisting carvings along the frame that looked like vines, or maybe snakes. The glass was cloudy, streaked, like it hadn't been touched in years. As I started to go through the boxes, I felt uneasy, like I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone standing there, watching me. But every time I looked, there was nothing, just the same eerie stillness and that mirror, its surface catching the light in strange ways, almost like something was moving just beneath the glass. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to work, throwing out boxes of moldy books and broken lamps. But then I found a small box, carefully wrapped in black fabric and tied with a string. Inside was a stack of old letters, faded and yellowed, with handwriting so small it was hard to read. I couldn't help myself. I started to read one of the letters. It was a letter from the original owner of the house, Mr. Charles's uncle, written to himself. In the letter, he talked about someone he called the lady in the mirror. He wrote about seeing her at night, watching him from the glass, how she'd smile at him, beckoning him closer. He mentioned strange whispers, promises she'd made, how she'd shown him things he couldn't describe. And then in one of the last letters he wrote, she says she's lonely. She says she wants to come through. I know I shouldn't let her, but she's so beautiful. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I glanced over at the mirror, half expecting to see someone looking back at me. But it was just my own reflection, warped and dim. I quickly stuffed the letters back in the box, wrapped it up, and shoved it in a pile to be thrown out. But the letters had unnerved me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the attic was somehow wrong, like it was holding on to something it shouldn't. I decided to finish up quickly, tossing boxes onto the landing, just trying to get out of there as fast as I could. But as I turned back to grab another box, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. I froze, my eyes locked on the glass, and I swear I saw something, a figure, just a shadow at first, then clearer, like someone was standing behind me. It was a woman, her face pale, eyes dark and hollow, staring right at me. Her lips curled into a slow, chilling smile, and she raised a hand, beckoning. I blinked, looked over my shoulder, but there was no one there, just me alone in the attic. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone, but the air was colder, heavier, and I felt this overwhelming urge to leave, to get as far from that attic as possible. I stumbled back, knocking over a box, sending papers scattering across the floor, but I didn't care. I rushed downstairs, left the attic door open, and didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. I told myself I'd come back the next day, finish up in the daylight when everything didn't feel so haunted. That night, I tried to put it out of my mind, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I got home, I noticed something strange, a dark smudge on my bathroom mirror, almost like a handprint, as if someone had pressed their hand against the glass from the inside. I scrubbed the mirror, but the smudge wouldn't go away, no matter how hard I tried. And that night, as I lay in bed, I could have sworn I heard whispering, faint but insistent, like someone calling my name from far away. The next morning, I went back to the house, determined to finish the job and get out of there. But when I reached the attic, I found the mirror had moved. It was now leaning against the attic door, blocking my way in, its cloudy surface reflecting the dim light in strange, shifting patterns. I didn't touch it. I didn't even go near it. I just turned and left, telling myself I'd come back with Mr. Charles to move it. But as I was leaving, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in the hallway mirror, and that's when I saw her again, standing right behind me, her face inches from mine, her smile wider, more twisted, her eyes fixed on me. I ran. I didn't care about the job, didn't care about the money. I just ran, left the house, and never looked back. But it didn't end there. That night, I found another smudge on my bathroom mirror, darker this time, like something was pressing harder against the glass. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just leftover residue. But every night, it's been there, a little darker, a little clearer. And every night, I hear the whispers, growing louder, calling my name, begging me to let her in. And I'm terrified because I don't know how much longer I can resist. The other night, I woke up to find myself standing in front of my bathroom mirror, staring into the glass, watching her smile back at me. I don't know what she wants, but I can feel her getting closer, reaching out from the other side. And every time I look in the mirror, I see her, just a little clearer, waiting for me to let her through. And I'm scared that one night, I won't have the strength to say no. It was supposed to be a routine errand. I've been meaning to change the light fixture in my bathroom for weeks. The old one had started flickering, and every time I looked up at it, I get this nagging feeling that it was time to replace it. So on a Sunday afternoon, I grabbed a new fixture from the hardware store, pulled up a quick how-to video, and set out to do the job myself. I'd done a few small electrical fixes before, so I didn't think much of it. How hard could it be? I shut off the bathroom circuit of the breaker, tested the switch to make sure the power was cut, and climbed up on the stool to unscrew the old fixture. Everything was going smoothly at first. I pulled the old fixture off, carefully twisted the wires loose, and unwrapped the electrical tape. But then, as I reached up to connect the wires for the new fixture, something strange happened. A tiny, almost imperceptible jolt went through my hand. It wasn't a painful shock, just a slight tingle, but it was enough to make me stop. I stared at the exposed wires in my hand, trying to figure out what went wrong. I'd turned off the breaker. I tested it. There should have been no power running through those wires. And yet, I'd felt something. A bit rattled, I climbed down, checked the breaker again, and confirmed it was off. But as I stood there staring at the open circuit, an uneasy feeling washed over me. What if the wiring in my apartment was faulty? What if power was still running through some other circuit that I couldn't see? I didn't want to take any chances, so I decided to call an electrician to check it out. The electrician arrived later that day, a grizzled man with a calm demeanor that only comes from years of experience. He listened patiently as I explained what happened, nodding as if he'd heard this story 100 times before. Then he went over to the breaker, examined it carefully, and started testing the wires. "Well," he said after a few minutes, "looks like you've got an old circuit that's partially live even when the breaker's off. Probably from some previous wiring job that didn't disconnect the neutral wire properly. It's rare, but it happens in older buildings." He explained that there was a stray current running through the neutral line, just enough to create a small charge. If I'd grabbed those wires more firmly, or if I'd accidentally touched the wrong part, I could have received a far worse shock, or even triggered a fire if there'd been a short circuit. I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd always been cautious with electricity, but this was a reminder of how even a simple DIY job could hide unexpected risks. As the electrician rewired the circuit, he shared stories about other close calls he'd encountered over the years. People who'd unknowingly drilled through live wires and walls, or who'd tried to fix light fixtures without realizing they were still hot. "You wouldn't believe how often people think they're safe just because they've flipped a switch," he said, shaking his head. "Electricity's funny that way. It only takes one mistake." After he left, I found myself looking around my apartment with a new sense of respect. I'd always thought of home as the safest place in the world, the one spot where everything was familiar and under control. But that day, I realized that familiarity can be deceiving. Behind the walls, under the floors, there were systems I barely understood, and they didn't care if I was careful or not. If anything went wrong, the consequences could be immediate and severe. Since then, I've approached every little home project with more caution than ever. I double-check the breaker, make sure every wire is secure, and I even invested in an outlet tester that checks for proper grounding and current. It may seem paranoid to some, but I'd rather take a few extra minutes than risk a repeat of that near miss. Not long after, I shared my story with my neighbor, Kyle, who was fixing up his kitchen at the time. I told him about the stray current, about how even with the breaker off, there was still a live wire lurking in the wall. Kyle listened, his eyes widening as he took it all in. I never thought about that, he admitted, scratching his head. I've been rewiring half my kitchen without even thinking twice. A few days later, he texted me a picture of a new voltage tester he'd bought, thanking me for the heads up. It felt good to know that maybe, by sharing my story, I'd help someone else avoid a potential hazard. These days, I take nothing for granted in my apartment. I check the wiring, I'm cautious with any repairs, and I never assume that just because something seems safe, it actually is. That slight shock was a warning, a reminder that the systems we rely on every day aren't foolproof. They're powerful, and they demand respect. Now, whenever I flip a switch or plug something in, I remember that faint tingle in my hand, that tiny warning from the wires. And I remind myself that safety isn't just about knowing what you're doing. It's about understanding that even in familiar spaces, there's always a bit of the unknown. And it's that respect for the unknown, that awareness of what could go wrong, that keeps us safe. I'm an ER nurse, working the night shift in a busy city hospital. It's the kind of job that changes you. Late nights, endless adrenaline, people coming in with every imaginable injury, illness, and more often than you'd expect, stories that haunt them. Most of the time, I can compartmentalize, let go of what I hear and see. But one patient, one night a few months back, is still on my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that I'll never really understand what happened. It was around 1 a.m., and we just wrapped up a trauma case, a bar fight gone wrong, when another call came in. A young man, early 20s, unresponsive, found in an alley downtown. The paramedics on the line sounded tense, which immediately set me on edge. They'd said he wasn't injured, wasn't intoxicated, and there were no signs of drugs on him or at the scene. He was just out, passed out, barely breathing, skin cold to the touch. When they wheeled him in, he was gaunt, almost skeletal, his skin pale, as if he hadn't seen the sun in weeks. He looked clean. His clothes weren't dirty, no sign of bruises or any outward injuries. But his hands, wrists, and arms were covered in small scratches, like he'd been clawing at something, trying to get away. I leaned down to check his vitals, and that's when I noticed his eyes were open, barely, but open. He was staring past me, his pupils unfocused, his face slack. I asked him his name, if he knew where he was, but he didn't respond. I squeezed his shoulder gently, trying to get him to snap out of it, but he just lay there, muttering something so soft I had to lean in close to hear it. At first, I thought it was gibberish, just disjointed, frantic whispers. But after a few seconds, the words became clear. I tried to leave. He kept repeating it, his voice a dull monotone, like he was stuck on a loop. I tried to calm him down, told him he was safe, that we'd take care of him. But he just kept repeating that phrase over and over. I tried to leave. After a while, his voice faded, his eyes drifting shut. We hooked him up to monitors, his heart rate low, but steady. Still, his breathing was shallow, and his body temperature was far below normal. It was as if he'd been lying out in the cold for hours, even though the night was warm, and he'd only been outside for a short time. We ran every test we could think of, blood work, scans, tox screens, but everything came back clean. No drugs, no signs of trauma, no medical explanation for why he was in this state. After about an hour, I went back to check on him. I was adjusting his fore when, suddenly, his hand shot up and grabbed my wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were wide open, locked onto mine, and he looked terrified. "They're still there," he whispered, his voice barely audible, trembling. "They're still down there. Don't go down there. Don't!" I tried to ask him what he meant, but he was rambling, his words fast and frantic, tumbling over each other in his panic. He kept saying something about the basement, and they wouldn't let me leave. I assumed he was hallucinating, maybe still in shock from whatever had happened. So I tried to calm him down, reassure him that he was safe, that he didn't have to worry about anything here. But then he looked at me with this intensity that made my skin crawl. "They're waiting for someone else," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They don't let anyone go. Not for long." After that, he went silent again, his grip loosening until his hand fell back to his side. I stayed with him for a while, watching his chest rise and fall, feeling a sense of unease settle over me. I dealt with my share of strange cases. People who were out of their minds, people who'd seen things that left them changed, but this was different. It was like he'd been somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, somewhere he shouldn't have survived. The rest of the night, I found myself glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until my shift was over, feeling this strange, heavy dread that I couldn't shake. Every time I checked on him, he was the same, silent, eyes half open, as if he were watching something only he could see. Just before dawn, I went back for one last check, but his bed was empty. I froze, my mind racing. I checked with the nurses at the station, but no one had seen him leave. Security combed through the hospital, but he was gone, without a trace. I checked his file, but there was no contact information, no ID, nothing to say who he was or where he'd come from. A few weeks later, I was out with a friend who worked at a shelter downtown. She was telling me about a young man who'd come in, looking disoriented, saying he'd been trapped somewhere, talking about people in a basement. She brushed it off as another lost kid, another case of someone losing themselves to drugs or paranoia. But when she described him, I knew it was the same guy. I don't know what happened to him after that. Every now and then, I still think about him, his empty eyes, his voice trembling with fear. I try to tell myself that he was just sick, maybe mentally ill, that whatever he was talking about was just in his head. But late at night, I can't help but wonder if he'd really been somewhere terrible, somewhere he'd barely escaped from, and if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the last person to end up there. This all started last month, but it already feels like a lifetime. I can't believe I let it get this far. I moved into a new apartment in September, a little one-bedroom on the 5th floor of an old, red brick building downtown. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and it was a fresh start. The rent was suspiciously low, but the landlord had just shrugged, mumbling something about high turnover. I should have asked more questions, but I was too desperate to care. At first, everything was fine. The place had its quirks, creaky floors, drafty windows, strange noises from the pipes, but it was cozy, and I was grateful to finally be on my own. But a few weeks after I moved in, things started to feel wrong. It began with little things. I'd come home from work to find my belongings slightly out of place. A glass I'd left on the counter would be in the sink. My keys would be on the floor instead of the hook. I figured I was just tired or distracted, maybe even sleepwalking. But as the days went by, it got worse. Every time I came home, something would be off. Doors I knew I'd closed were wide open. Lights I'd left on were dark. One night, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth when I heard a faint creak from the other room. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, toothbrush in hand, listening. The apartment was silent. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, but something about it felt wrong. I turned off the bathroom light and stepped out into the hallway, my ears straining. From the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Just a flicker, like a shadow slipping around the corner into my bedroom. I stood there, my pulse pounding, but forced myself to walk to the bedroom and turn on the light. The room was empty, just my bed and dresser, the usual clutter. I laughed at myself, told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the carpet by the window. The prints were long, too large to be mine, and led from the window to the hallway before fading. I told myself it must have been there before, and I just missed it. Maybe the carpet was old, stained, but I couldn't ignore the growing dread in the pit of my stomach. Over the next few days, things got worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering, soft and indistinct, like someone speaking just outside my window. I'd lie there, frozen, straining to hear, but the voices would fade as soon as I sat up. I tried recording the sounds on my phone, but every time I played the audio back, there was nothing, just silence. One night, I came home late from work. I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open, but as I stepped into my apartment, I felt it, the unmistakable sense that someone else was there. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name, like a presence lingering just out of sight. I forced myself to look around, checking every room, every closet, even the tiny pantry in the kitchen. But I was alone. I decided to sleep on the couch that night, too unnerved to go into the bedroom. I finally drifted off, only to wake up hours later to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. I lay there, heart pounding, staring at the hallway, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I told myself it was just the draft, just my imagination, and closed my eyes, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. And then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound like someone dragging their feet slowly across the carpet. It was coming from the bedroom, moving toward me. My entire body went cold, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I stayed still, whatever it was would go away. But the footsteps stopped, right by the couch. I felt a chill settle over me, colder than anything I'd ever felt, like the air itself had frozen. I held my breath, barely daring to breathe, praying that this was some kind of nightmare, that I'd wake up any second. And then I felt it, a weight pressing down on the edge of the couch, as though someone had sat down right next to me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, my body frozen in terror. I lay there, every nerve on fire, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the weight stayed there, unmoving, pressing down beside me, close enough that I could feel the chill radiating from it. Finally, I forced myself to look, to open my eyes and see what was sitting beside me. There was nothing there, just the empty couch, the dim outline of the room, and the heavy silence pressing down on me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I grabbed my things and left, not bothering to pack anything but the essentials. I called my landlord from the car, told him I was breaking the lease. He just sighed, like he'd expected it, and told me to leave the keys in the mailbox. I asked him if anyone else had ever complained about the apartment, but he just said, "People come and go. You're not the first." I moved in with a friend, hoping that whatever was in that apartment would stay behind. But it didn't. Last night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my friend's guest room. Slow, shuffling footsteps moving closer. I lay there, paralyzed, listening as the footsteps stopped just outside my door. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, and a dark figure slipped inside, standing in the corner, watching. I don't know what it wants. I don't know why it followed me, but I can feel it now, even in the daylight, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And every night, it comes closer. It happened gradually, so slowly that I almost didn't notice. But looking back, I can see every little clue as if it's lit up in neon. We've been together for almost 4 years, and while it hadn't always been easy, we'd built something solid, something I thought I could depend on. We shared a home, a cat, weekend plans, and long-term dreams. I thought I knew everything about him, but as it turns out, I only knew the parts he'd let me see. The first clue was his new gym routine. He'd never been much of a fitness enthusiast, but suddenly he was working out 5 days a week, sometimes twice a day. He'd leave in the mornings before work, come home to shower, then head back to the gym after dinner. I was proud of him for taking care of himself, even tease him about becoming a gym bro. He'd laugh it off, say he was just trying to be healthy. But there was something strange about it. The way he'd linger by the door, checking his phone, his face lighting up before he headed out. I thought it was just endorphins. Then there were the work dinners. He'd always been close with his colleagues, but these dinners started happening more and more often, always at odd times, and in places I'd never heard of. He'd come home smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his, with little details about the evening that didn't quite add up. "Who all went with you?" I'd ask, and he'd give me a vague answer, his gaze shifting just slightly. "Just a few people from the office. You don't know them." It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it planted a seed of doubt in the back of my mind, something I tried to ignore but couldn't quite shake. One evening, he told me he'd be home late again, some big project deadline he had to work on with the team. I offered to bring him coffee, a nice little surprise to show I cared. His face went pale. No, don't worry about it," he said a bit too quickly, almost panicked. "We'll probably be moving around a lot. I wouldn't want you to waste a trip." I felt my chest tighten, a cold suspicion creeping in, but I forced myself to smile, pretending to accept his excuse. That night, I barely slept, lying awake in the dark as his absence loomed beside me, heavy and undeniable. I replayed every strange moment, every tiny red flag that I'd tried to brush aside. When he finally came home, I pretended to be asleep, my back turned as he slipped into bed without a word. The real turning point came a week later. He was in the shower, and his phone lit up on the bathroom counter with a message preview from a name I didn't recognize, Mia. I glanced at it without thinking, and the words stopped me cold. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. My stomach dropped, and I felt the room tilt. The message was casual, but there was an intimacy in it that cut deeper than any blatant confession. I sat there, frozen, as the reality of it hit me. This man I'd loved and trusted, the man I'd built my life around, had been hiding something from me, something I'd only glimpsed in brief moments of suspicion. It all made sense now. The gym sessions, the late nights, the guarded phone, the way he'd laugh off my questions as if I were imagining things. When he came out of the shower, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, his phone in my hand, my expression giving away everything. He froze, the color draining from his face as he saw the open message. I asked him who she was, my voice steady but barely a whisper. He opened his mouth, started to say something, but the lie died on his lips. There was no point in pretending anymore. He knew I'd seen enough. He stammered, trying to explain, saying things like it didn't mean anything and it was just a fling. I listened, numb, as he tried to spin the story into something smaller, less painful, but nothing he said could lessen the hurt. I asked him why, my voice breaking as I struggled to understand. He looked down, guilt etched into every line of his face, saying he didn't know, that he never meant for it to go this far. But those words were empty, meaningless, and I could feel the life we'd built together crumble in an instant. I told him to leave. He begged me for another chance, swore he'd end it, that he'd change. But the damage was done. I couldn't unsee that message, couldn't forget the months of lies and secrecy, the way he'd chosen someone else over me, even if only for fleeting moments. He packed a bag that night, moving out with the same haste he'd shown whenever he'd left for those work dinners. When the door closed, a silence settled over the apartment, a heavy, aching quiet that seemed to echo with every broken promise, every memory now tainted by betrayal. In the days that followed, I went through the motions, my heart numb, my mind replaying every moment we'd shared, every sign I'd missed. Friends tried to comfort me, telling me I'd done the right thing, that I was better off without him. But their words barely reached me. I felt hollow, like a part of me had been ripped away, leaving only a raw emptiness in its place. But as the weeks turned into months, I slowly began to rebuild. I threw myself into work, reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with, rediscovered hobbies I hadn't touched in years. I rearranged the apartment, painted the walls, filled the space with things that felt like me. Each small act was a reclaiming of my life, a quiet rebellion against the hurt he'd left behind. One evening, while I was cleaning out the closet, I found an old photo of us from that concert where we'd first met, both of us laughing, caught up in the energy of the crowd. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a bittersweet ache in my chest. I remembered the way I'd once looked at him, the trust I'd felt, the certainty that we were meant to be. But now, that moment felt like a relic, a glimpse of a life that was no longer mine. I put the photo away, not out of anger or sadness, but with a quiet acceptance. I knew that part of my life was over, and while the scars were still there, I could feel myself healing, becoming someone stronger, someone who wouldn't ignore those subtle red flags again. A few months later, he reached out, asking to meet, saying he wanted to apologize. I thought about it, debated going, wondered if hearing him say he was sorry would bring me closure. But in the end, I didn't need his apology. I'd already found my own peace, my own strength. I'd learned that I was enough, that I deserved a love that was whole and honest, a love that didn't hide behind locked screens and empty promises. So I didn't reply. I let his message go unanswered, a silent but final goodbye to the life we'd once shared. And as I went to bed that night, I felt a lightness, a quiet certainty that I was finally, truly free. I'd survived the hurt, found my way back to myself, and in the process discovered that I was stronger than any heartbreak, stronger than any betrayal. Now, I walk forward with a new sense of clarity, my heart open but wiser, ready for a future that's mine alone. And when love comes again, as I know it will, I'll welcome it with open arms, unafraid, knowing that I am whole, complete, and worthy just as I am. There's a stretch of highway outside my hometown that locals call the Forgotten Mile. It's the kind of road you only take if you're in a hurry because it shaves off a few minutes between towns, but it has a reputation that makes most people avoid it. Over the years, there have been too many stories, strange accidents, eerie sightings. Growing up, I heard about people who swore they saw figures standing by the roadside or headlights appearing in their mirrors that would vanish as soon as they looked back. I'd always shrugged it off, thinking it was just small-town talk. But that changed last winter. It was late December, one of those bitterly cold nights where the air is so still it feels heavy. I'd been at a friend's house and stayed later than I meant to, so when I left around midnight, I decided to take the Forgotten Mile to get home faster. The road was empty, blanketed in a thin layer of snow that reflected the moonlight, making everything look ghostly and pale. For the first few minutes, everything was fine. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the road and casting long shadows across the snow-dusted trees. I was about halfway through the mile, humming along to the radio, when I saw a figure standing on the side of the road just at the edge of the light. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, or maybe a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like he'd stepped out of another time. Heavy coat, scarf, boots caked with snow. He was standing perfectly still, staring at something in the distance, his face turned away from me. I slowed down, trying to get a better look, but something about him felt off. He wasn't moving, wasn't looking around, just staring straight ahead, as if he didn't even notice my car. I felt a chill run down my spine, and without thinking, I sped up, passing him quickly. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him step onto the road, his face still turned away, following the path of my car. I kept driving, my heart pounding, telling myself it was nothing, just some guy walking home in the middle of nowhere. But a few minutes later, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. There, on the side of the road, was the same figure, standing a little closer this time, his face still turned away, still staring into the distance. A shiver ran through me, but I didn't stop. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel, eyes locked on the road. But then, just as I was nearing the end of the mile, I saw him again, right at the edge of my headlights. This time, he was standing in the middle of the road, facing me, his head tilted, eyes dark and empty, watching me with a stare that felt like it cut right through the glass. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt, my heart racing as I stared at him, too stunned to move. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared at me, his expression blank, his eyes hollow. And then he took a step forward. I gasped, instinctively putting the car in reverse. But the wheels spun uselessly in the snow, my tires struggling for traction. The man took another step, his boots crunching on the snow, each movement slow, deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine. I could see him more clearly now, the details of his face, pale, gaunt, with deep shadows under his eyes, his skin stretched tight, his mouth curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Desperation took over, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching forward, barely gripping the icy road. I swerved around him, feeling the cold prickle of his gaze on me as I sped past. As soon as I was clear, I gunned it, my pulse pounding in my ears, heart racing as I tore down the last stretch of the Forgotten Mile. Finally, I reached the main road, the lights of town flickering in the distance, and I let out a shaky breath, glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there. But the road behind me was empty, the dark trees still, as if nothing had happened at all. When I got home, I locked every door and window, spending the rest of the night sitting by the window, staring out into the quiet street, unable to shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. The next morning, I told a few friends about what happened, expecting them to laugh or tell me I was imagining things. But one of them, a guy who'd lived in town his whole life, looked at me with a strange expression, like he'd seen something similar. "They say if you see him once, he'll find you again," he said quietly. "Doesn't matter where you are. Some people say he's looking for someone, and if he decides it's you, well, he follows you." I laughed it off, telling myself it was just a story, a warning to keep people off that road. But since that night, I've had this feeling, this prickling at the back of my neck, like I'm being watched. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a figure standing on the side of the road, watching me as I pass. It was around 2 a.m. when I got the call. My friend Rachel had gone out to meet some friends, and her car wouldn't start. She asked if I could pick her up from a diner just off an old stretch of highway a few towns over. I'd driven that road a handful of times and knew it was one of those lonely, empty stretches. No lights, just miles of darkness broken up by occasional trees and empty fields. I threw on a jacket, grabbed my keys, and headed out. The drive was uneventful at first, the usual hum of tires against asphalt and the flicker of my high beams stretching out ahead. The road was deserted, and I found myself zoning out, my thoughts drifting as I counted the miles until I'd reach her. Then, out of nowhere, my car radio started crackling. Static filled the speakers, cutting through the quiet. I looked down, fiddling with the dial, thinking it must have been some interference. But no matter what I did, the static stayed, growing louder and more insistent. Just as I was about to turn it off entirely, the static shifted. Through the crackling, I could swear I heard something, faint, muffled like a voice whispering through the static. I turned up the volume, trying to make out the words, but it was too faint, a string of sounds that didn't quite make sense. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the static cut out, replaced by silence, the radio going completely dead. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weirdness of it, chalking it up to the quirks of an old car radio. But as I refocused on the road, I realized something was off. The fields, the familiar landmarks, the mile markers, I couldn't see any of them. It was as if the road had swallowed me, stretching endlessly in both directions, with nothing but empty blackness beyond the reach of my headlights. I slowed down, glancing at the GPS on my phone. The screen showed nothing but an endless loop, the arrow spinning as if it couldn't get a fix on my location. I frowned, glancing out the window, feeling that creeping unease settle in my stomach. I'd taken this road enough times to know I should have passed a gas station or a rest stop by now. But there was nothing, just mile after mile of empty, unbroken road. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure standing just off the side of the road, barely visible in the darkness. My heart jumped, and I instinctively slowed down, my headlights catching the faint outline of a person, a woman standing in the tall grass, her head tilted slightly to one side, staring at me. She was dressed in what looked like an old, tattered nightgown, her hair hanging down in dark, tangled strands. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly in the headlights, and her eyes were wide and fixed on me, unblinking, as if she'd been standing there waiting. I froze, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. For a second, I considered stopping, rolling down the window, asking if she needed help. But something about her stopped me. The stillness, the unnatural way she held herself, the blank, hollow look in her eyes. I kept driving, my heart racing. The woman's image burned into my mind. As I passed her, she didn't move, didn't turn, just watched as my car rolled by, her head tilting slightly as if to follow me. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her fade into the distance. But she didn't. Instead, she was still there, standing in the middle of the road, her figure growing smaller and smaller in my mirror, but always watching, her eyes never leaving me. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, my hands gripping the wheel, so tightly my knuckles turned white. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tired hitchhiker or a stray thought from too many horror movies. Then, up ahead, I saw her again, standing on the side of the road, exactly where she'd been before, her figure barely visible in the dark, her head tilted in that same unnatural way, her eyes fixed on me. My pulse raced as I sped past, glancing back to see her fading into the darkness again, only to reappear moments later. standing just ahead, waiting. It was like some sick game. The same woman appearing over and over, her face growing clearer each time, her expression colder, more intense. The headlights would catch her eyes, and they'd glint with an unnatural light, as if reflecting something not of this world. She never moved, never spoke, just watched, and with every passing mile, she felt closer, as if she were somehow pulling me deeper into her grip. Panicked, I floored the gas, desperate to put as much distance between me and that woman as possible. The car sped forward, the engine roaring, my headlights cutting through the dark in a desperate attempt to escape whatever this was. But the faster I went, the more she seemed to close in, her face growing clearer, more vivid, until it felt like she was right beside me, her eyes boring into me from the darkness. Finally, I saw it, the lights of the diner in the distance flickering like a beacon, a promise of safety. I gripped the wheel, my heart hammering, and drove toward it with everything I had, praying that if I could just reach the lights, she'd disappear. As I pulled into the parking lot, I glanced in the mirror one last time, half expecting to see her standing there, her empty eyes staring back. But she was gone, the road behind me empty, the darkness fading as the lights of the diner filled my vision. I stumbled out of the car, shaking, barely able to breathe as I scanned the parking lot, searching for any sign of her. Rachel was there, waiting by the door, her face lighting up when she saw me, but I could barely focus on her, my mind still trapped in the nightmare of that endless, haunted road. I didn't tell her what I'd seen, didn't explain why my hands were shaking or why I kept glancing over my shoulder. But even now, whenever I drive that road, I feel her presence lurking just beyond the headlights, waiting. And sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I see her in the distance, standing just off the side of the road, her head tilted, her empty eyes fixed on me as if she's still waiting, still watching, still there. About 6 months ago, I started working the night shift at a small, family-owned gas station on the outskirts of town. I was in a rough patch, financially and personally, and the isolation of the job sounded appealing. It's one of those stations that hardly anyone stops at anymore, tucked away off the main road, surrounded by fields and trees. Most nights, the place is dead quiet. Just me, the buzz of the fluorescent lights, and the occasional car that pulls in for gas or directions. At first, it was just boring, which suited me fine. I'd sit behind the counter with a book or scroll through my phone, trying to stay awake until morning. But after a few weeks, things started happening that I couldn't explain. Little things at first. The sound of footsteps outside when I knew there was no one there. The faint hum of a radio playing somewhere in the building, even though we didn't have one. One night, as I was stocking shelves, I heard someone cough, low and gravelly, coming from the back of the store. I froze listening, but the sound didn't come again. I walked to the back, checked the supply room, the bathroom, even outside by the dumpsters, but the place was empty. When I came back inside, though, something felt different. Like the air was heavier, colder somehow, as if someone had been standing right behind me and had only just stepped away. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just paranoid. But the weird occurrences kept happening, and with each night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape slipping around the shelves, or a flicker of shadow by the door. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, the sleep deprivation messing with my mind. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Then, one night around 2 a.m., a man came into the store. He was the first customer I'd seen in hours, and he looked strange. He was tall and thin, dressed in a long coat that was too heavy for the warm night, his face gaunt and pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He walked slowly, almost shuffling, his gaze fixed on the floor as he moved to the back of the store, disappearing down one of the aisles. I waited at the counter, expecting him to come back with something, but he didn't. Minutes passed, and I didn't hear a sound. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. I stood up, craning my neck to look down the aisle, but he wasn't there. I checked each aisle one by one, my heart pounding, but he was gone. The store was empty. I went back to the counter, trying to convince myself he'd just left without me noticing. But then, as I turned back to face the front, I saw him standing outside the glass door, staring at me. He was completely still, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His face was pressed close to the glass, his breath fogging it up, but he didn't move, didn't blink. He just watched. I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming at me to lock the door, to do something, but I was frozen, unable to look away from those eyes. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand and pressed it to the glass, his fingers splayed out, long and thin. And in a voice barely louder than a whisper, I heard him say, "It's almost time." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep the next day. I couldn't get his face out of my mind, couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, waiting. The words, "It's almost time," echoed in my head, gnawing at me, filling me with a dread I couldn't explain. The next few nights, I was on edge, jumping at every sound, every flicker of shadow. But he didn't come back. I started to relax, thinking maybe he'd just been some weirdo passing through, that it was all over. But that's when things got worse. One night, around the same time, I was sitting behind the counter, fighting off sleep, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from the supply room. I grabbed a flashlight and walked to the back, my hands trembling. The door was ajar, swinging slightly, but when I pushed it open, the room was empty. Just rows of shelves, stacked with cleaning supplies and boxes. But as I turned to leave, the light caught something on the floor, a trail of wet, muddy footprints leading from the door into the room. They were large, the kind that would have matched the man who'd come to the store. I followed the trail to the far corner of the room, where they abruptly stopped in front of the wall. There was no exit, no window, just an old, cracked wall. But the footprints ended there, as if he'd just vanished. I stumbled back out into the store, my heart racing, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. But as I reached the counter, I stopped cold. Written in the fog on the glass door were 3 words scrawled in long, uneven letters. "It's time now." I don't remember driving home that morning. I was in a daze, my mind consumed with panic. I called in sick the next night, told myself I'd quit, that I'd never go back. But as the days went by, I convinced myself that it had all been in my head, a mix of exhaustion and paranoia. After all, no one else had seen anything, and the owner hadn't mentioned any strange occurrences. So, against every instinct, I went back to work. That first night back, everything seemed normal, quiet. I started to relax, thinking maybe it was all over. But around 2 a.m., just as I was beginning to let my guard down, I heard it, a faint tapping on the glass. I looked up, and there he was standing outside the door, his face pressed to the glass, smiling that same, empty smile. He was closer this time, his hand tapping slowly, rhythmically on the glass. "Let me in," he whispered, his voice muffled but clear, as though he were right next to me. I backed away, shaking my head, but he kept tapping, that smile never fading, his eyes never leaving mine. "Let me in," he repeated, louder this time, more insistent. I fumbled for my phone, dialing the police, but the call wouldn't go through. I tried again and again, but every time, the line was dead. Then, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the store into darkness. I could still see him outside, illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlight, his face twisted into something cruel, something hungry. He pressed his face closer, his eyes wide and gleaming in the dark. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then, slowly, he reached down, his fingers curling around the door handle. I ran to the back room, slamming the door shut, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could hear the door creak open, footsteps echoing in the store, slow and deliberate, the sound growing closer with each passing second. I crouched in the corner, every muscle tense, listening to the footsteps as they drew nearer, stopping just outside the door. There was a long, agonizing silence, and then I heard him whisper right on the other side, "It's time." I don't remember what happened after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was up, the store was empty, and everything looked normal. The police didn't believe me. The owner thought I was just trying to get out of working the night shift. But I know what I saw. I know he was real. I quit that day. I moved to a new city, far from that gas station, far from that man. But every night, at exactly 2 a.m., I still hear it. That faint rhythmic tapping like someone knocking, waiting just outside my door. And every time, I hear his voice, soft and insistent, whispering, "Let me in." My friend Caleb had been waiting for months to get his hands on the latest gaming console. He'd saved up, read all the reviews, and set an alarm to be ready the second pre-orders opened. But the moment he hit refresh, the console was already sold out. Bots had swept in, and the consoles were instantly on resale sites for triple the price. Caleb texted me, furious, with a screenshot of the prices. "They're basically auctioning off everything cool to the people who can throw the most cash at it," he wrote. "I just wanted to play a game, man." Around the same time, I was going through a weird situation with a job application. I'd applied to a position that seemed tailor-made for me. They'd kept me hanging for weeks, scheduling interview after interview, all while telling me I was a strong candidate. I poured hours into preparing, envisioning what I could bring to the team. Then, after the final round, they just vanished. No email, no call, no explanation. When I finally followed up, the recruiter said they'd gone with internal restructuring and weren't hiring for the position after all. It felt like I'd been used, like all my enthusiasm was just something to toy with before they moved on. "I swear," I told Caleb, "it's like they're just messing with us to see how much we'll dance." One night, Caleb and I met up for drinks to blow off steam. He was still fuming about the console, and I was venting about the job ghosting. Our friend Lydia joined us, and soon she was telling us about her own frustrations at work. She's a data analyst, and lately, her job had been getting into a territory that made her uncomfortable. "You'd be shocked at the level of tracking we're doing on people," she said, glancing around like she was sharing a secret. "We know where they go, what they buy, even what they're thinking about buying." She sighed, running her hand through her hair. "And it's not just about improving the user experience. We're selling that info to anyone willing to pay." We looked down at our phones, suddenly aware of just how much of our lives have been sliced up, packaged, and sold to the highest bidder. It was unsettling, realizing how little of ourselves actually felt private anymore. The apps, the devices, all of it was just another way for companies to peek into our lives and cash in on every small moment. Then Lydia pulled up a headline she'd seen earlier about yet another insider trading scandal in Congress. Apparently, several politicians have been tipped off about an upcoming regulation change and dumped stocks just in time to avoid major losses. "So they get to use secrets for profit, and we're supposed to just accept it?" she said, shaking her head. "If any of us tried that, we'd be in jail." The irony was maddening. The people making the rules could just rewrite them when it suited them, while the rest of us had to play by the book. On our way out of the bar, we walked past a billboard for an online gambling site, plastered with smiling faces and bright colors. It made betting look like the happiest place on earth, promising a big win to anyone willing to play. Caleb shook his head, muttering, "They make it look like a ticket to happiness." He told us about his older brother, who'd gotten hooked on online sports betting. It started as something small, just to make watching games a bit more exciting, but soon it spiraled. His brother was in deep now, struggling to pay off debts, and the ads just kept taunting him with the idea that the next win was always around the corner. As we walked down the street, a police car pulled up nearby, and the officers started checking IDs on random people just hanging out. They seemed bored, not really looking for anything, just exerting power because they could. We kept our distance, watching as they stopped a young guy, asking him a million questions about where he'd been and what he was doing. It felt like another reminder that there was always someone watching, always someone in control. Lydia sighed, her face dark. "We're all just suspects now, aren't we?" By the time we reached our street, we all felt the same dull frustration, a sense that nothing was really ours. Not our time, not our data, not even our moments of joy. Caleb looked at us, his hands stuffed in his pockets, and said, "Feels like everything we care about is just bait now. Stuff to pull us in, bleed us dry, and leave us empty." None of us had an answer, but as we split off into the night, his words lingered. The postcard arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a grocery flyer and a dentist reminder card. It was the kind of faded, worn postcard you'd find in a thrift shop with a picture of a tiny town I'd never heard of, Cedar Valley. The photo showed a lone red cabin, surrounded by tall pine trees and a sliver of a lake, the whole scene cast in warm, golden sunlight. But it wasn't the picture that caught my attention, it was the handwriting. I hadn't seen that handwriting in over a decade, but I recognized it instantly. Curvy, half-print, half-cursive letters with a slight slant to the left. It was from Sam, my best friend from high school. The one who disappeared after graduation without a word, leaving behind nothing but rumors and unanswered questions. I turned the postcard over, my heart pounding. There was no return address, just a simple message written in Sam's familiar hand. "Come find me. I'm finally ready to tell you everything." The message was scrawled so hastily, it looked like it might slide off the card, the ink slightly smudged as if the pen had barely finished its last stroke. There was no explanation, no directions, just that simple, cryptic line. It was absurd, ridiculous even, but the moment I read it, I knew I was going to go. I couldn't explain it, but after years of wondering what had happened to Sam, I felt like I owed it to both of us to find out. The next morning, I threw a few things into a duffel bag, grabbed the postcard, and set off. Cedar Valley wasn't on any major maps. It was tucked away in the northern hills, reachable only by winding roads that twisted and turned through miles of dense forest. The drive took hours, and by the time I spotted the "Welcome to Cedar Valley" sign, dusk had already settled over the landscape, casting long shadows across the road. The town was tiny, barely more than a cluster of buildings. A gas station, a post office, a general store, and a diner. I parked and stepped out, the air crisp and cool, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I pulled the postcard from my bag, looking at the cabin in the photo. Somewhere in this town, Sam was waiting. And finally, after all these years, I was about to get the answers I'd been searching for. The diner was the only place open, so I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling as I walked in. A few locals looked up, giving me curious glances before returning to their conversations. The waitress, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a braid, approached with a smile that seemed both warm and suspicious. "Evening," she greeted me, her voice soft. "Can I get you something?" I slid into a booth and took a deep breath. "Actually, I'm looking for someone. A friend of mine, Sam. Sam used to live here, I think." The waitress's smile faded a little, replaced with something unreadable. Haven't heard that name in a while." I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "So you knew Sam?" She nodded slowly, looking around as if making sure no one else was listening. "Sam used to come by here a lot. Real nice kid. Kept to themselves mostly, but had a way about him. People around here still talk about it now. And then, one day, Sam just stopped coming, like they'd vanished into thin air." I swallowed, nodding. "I got this," I said, holding up the postcard. "It's from Sam. I don't know why, but it feels like they want me to find them." The waitress's eyes softened, and she gave a faint nod, as if she understood. "Well, if Sam's anywhere around here, it'd be up by the old lake cabin. People say it's empty," but she trailed off, glancing over her shoulder. "Well, you know how people are. They say a lot of things." The directions she gave me were simple, but the roads leading out to the lake were narrow and rough, twisting through dense woods that seemed to close in around me the farther I drove. By the time I reached the edge of the lake, the last light of day was slipping below the horizon, casting a dark, eerie glow over everything. I got out of the car, scanning the shore. There it was, the red cabin from the postcard, half hidden behind a cluster of trees, its windows dark and still. I felt a chill run through me as I approached, each step crunching softly on the gravel. When I reached the door, I hesitated, a dozen questions racing through my mind. But before I could second-guess myself, the door creaked open, as if someone had been waiting for me. Inside, the cabin was dim, illuminated only by a few flickering candles placed on a small table by the window. And there, sitting in the shadows, was Sam. I barely recognized them at first. They looked older, worn down, their face lined with experiences I couldn't even begin to imagine. But their eyes, the same sharp, bright eyes I remembered from high school, met mine, and suddenly, it was like no time had passed at all. Sam, I whispered, unable to keep the tremble out of my voice. They gave me a faint smile, gesturing for me to sit. It's good to see you, Tom, they said softly, their voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure if you'd come. Of course I came, I replied, feeling a strange mix of relief and anger. You disappeared without a word, Sam. No one knew what happened to you. Why did you leave? Sam looked down, their fingers tracing the edge of the table. I know. I owe you an explanation, but it's complicated. I waited, letting the silence fill the room, until finally, Sam took a deep breath and began to speak. They told me about things I'd never imagined. How they'd felt trapped, how they'd struggled with things they couldn't share with anyone. How, on the night of graduation, they'd realized they couldn't stay in that town, in that life. I had to go, they whispered, their voice trembling. I didn't know who I was back then, and I couldn't figure it out there, surrounded by people who'd always seen me as someone else. So you just left? I asked, the hurt evident in my voice. They nodded, looking away. It was selfish, but I needed to find myself, to figure out who I was when no one was watching, when no one had expectations of who I should be. I had to become me. I looked at them, realizing that the person sitting before me was both the Sam I'd known and a stranger, someone shaped by years and experiences I couldn't comprehend. And as much as it hurt to know they'd left without a word, I could see the weight they carried, the struggle that had brought them to this place, to this moment. So, why now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why reach out after all this time? Sam's eyes softened, and they reached into their pocket, pulling out a small, weathered key. They placed it on the table between us, their hand lingering over it for a moment. This is for you, they said. It's the key to the cabin. I'm moving on again, somewhere new, but I wanted you to have this place, to know that I'm okay, and to remind you that sometimes it's okay to lose yourself, Tom, to step away and find who you really are. I stared at the key, feeling the weight of everything unspoken between us. Sam was leaving again, but this time there was a sense of closure, of understanding. I picked up the key, clutching it tightly, and looked up at them. I wish you'd told me back then, I said quietly, feeling a mixture of sadness and gratitude. But I'm glad you told me now. They nodded, their eyes shimmering in the candlelight. Take care of yourself, Tom, they whispered. And take care of this place. It's yours now, in case you ever need to get a little lost too. With that, they stood, gave me one last, lingering look, and slipped out into the night, disappearing into the shadows just as silently as they'd arrived. I stayed in the cabin until dawn, sitting alone in the flickering light, feeling the weight of the key in my hand. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the lake, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, a sense of closure, and the quiet thrill of a mystery finally, softly solved. It was late autumn when I first started feeling the drift between us, a chill in the air that seemed to settle right into our home. We'd been together for nearly 6 years, and I thought I knew him like the lines on my own hands. But lately, he'd been more distant, quieter, as if carrying secrets that left shadows in his eyes. It was subtle at first, a missed goodnight kiss here, a forgotten anniversary there. But over time, those little things began to add up, piece by painful piece. One night, he told me he was going to a work dinner. That wasn't unusual. He was always meeting clients, and late nights were part of his job. But when he left, there was something different in the way he said goodbye. A hesitation, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. I stood by the window after he drove off, feeling an inexplicable ache in my chest, as if some part of me already knew what I was about to find out. It was 2 hours later when I got a message from a friend. She'd seen him at a bar downtown, laughing with a woman I didn't know. She'd recognized him instantly, but the way he leaned in close to this woman, the way they laughed like they shared some intimate joke, it didn't look like work, she said. My stomach dropped. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it must have been a colleague, some harmless interaction blown out of proportion. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and once it was there, I couldn't shake it. That night, when he came home, he smelled different, a faint, sweet scent that didn't belong to me. He kissed my cheek, barely meeting my eyes, and mumbled something about a long night before retreating to the shower. I sat there on the edge of our bed, staring at the empty space beside me, feeling the weight of 1,000 questions pressing down. The next few weeks were a strange, surreal blur. He'd come home late more often, offering vague excuses, talking about work pressure and big projects. He'd leave early in the morning, a new cologne clinging to him that felt like a stranger's scent in our home. Whenever I tried to bring it up, he'd brush me off, telling me I was imagining things, that I was overthinking. I wanted to believe him, but that feeling of dread lingered, twisting and coiling in my gut like a sickness. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. He'd left his laptop open on the kitchen counter, his emails pulled up on the screen. I hesitated, my heart pounding, telling myself it was wrong to look, that I should just talk to him. But curiosity won out. My hands shook as I scrolled through his inbox, looking for any hint of what I feared was true. And then I saw it, a series of emails from someone named Anna. Their messages filled with subtle flirtation, shared secrets, the kind of warmth I hadn't felt from him in months. My hands went cold, my heart hammering as I read each message. They'd been meeting after work, sharing quiet dinners, moments I'd thought belonged to us. She called him by a nickname I'd never heard before, one that felt intimate and foreign, like a piece of him he'd given to someone else. I closed the laptop, feeling the weight of betrayal settle over me, an ache that seemed to sink down to my bones. When he came home that night, I confronted him. I stood in the doorway, my voice shaking as I asked him about Anna. He went still, his face paling as he realized he'd been caught. He tried to deny it, but the truth was already written in his eyes, in the way he couldn't hold my gaze. Finally, he sighed, sitting down, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "It's not what you think," he began, his voice hollow, but I could hear the lie in every word. I listened in silence as he stumbled through his excuses, saying they'd only talked, that it wasn't serious. But nothing he said could take away the hurt, the betrayal that had settled deep in my heart. I told him I needed him to leave, that I couldn't bear to look at him, to live in a home filled with memories that now felt tainted. He left that night, taking a bag and leaving behind the life we'd built together. The silence in our apartment was suffocating, each room filled with echoes of laughter and love that now felt like a cruel joke. I spent hours going over every memory, every moment I'd thought was real, wondering how long he'd been lying, how much of our life together had been a facade. The days that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. Friends came by, bringing food, their quiet company a balm to my fractured heart. I deleted his photos, packed up his things, trying to rid our home of any trace of him. But it was the small things that hurt the most. The empty mug on the kitchen counter, his book left open on the nightstand, the faint smell of his cologne that still lingered on our sheets. But as time passed, I started to rebuild. I threw myself into work, into long walks, into moments of solitude that helped me find peace. I started reading again, painting again, finding pieces of myself I'd forgotten. Little by little, I reclaimed my life, filling the spaces he'd left empty with new memories, new dreams that were mine alone. Months later, he reached out, asking to meet, saying he wanted to talk things over. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else, wondering what he could possibly say to make up for what he'd done. We met at a cafe we used to visit together, the familiarity of the place tinged with a bittersweet ache. He looked different, tired, almost regretful. He apologized, stumbling over his words, telling me he hadn't meant to hurt me, that he'd been lost. But as he spoke, I realized that I didn't need his apology. I'd found my own closure, my own way forward. I told him goodbye, real goodbye this time, one that left no room for going back. As I walked away, I felt lighter, free from the weight of betrayal that had once felt so heavy. I was whole again, stronger for the heartbreak I'd survived. And though the scars would always be there, I knew they were a testament to my resilience, a reminder of the strength I'd found in myself. In the end, I walked away from that chapter of my life with a quiet sense of peace, knowing that I deserved a love that was honest, whole, and true. And until I found it, I was content, happy in the knowledge that I'd built a life that was mine, a life filled with the things that made me feel alive and free. We met in college, in one of those classes neither of us wanted to take, but somehow had to. He'd sat behind me, and within a week, he was passing me notes full of little doodles and jokes about our professor's monotone voice. It was easy to fall for him. He had this warmth, this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. We'd spend hours talking about everything, from our weirdest childhood memories to our biggest dreams. By the end of the semester, we were inseparable, and I honestly believed we'd stay that way forever. Years went by, and we built a life together. We moved into a small apartment with creaky floors and drafty windows, and filled it with mismatched furniture, thrift store finds, and stacks of books. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I loved it. I loved him. We had routines, Saturday morning breakfasts at our favorite cafe, movie nights curled up on the couch, lazy Sunday afternoons spent wandering through the park. It was the kind of life that felt steady, safe, real. But looking back, I can see now how things started to change, small and almost invisible, like a crack in the foundation that you don't notice until the walls start shifting. He got a new job, one that came with late nights and endless meetings. At first, I was thrilled for him. He'd worked so hard, and he deserved this. But the job seemed to pull him further away, even when he was right there beside me. He'd come home distracted, quiet, his mind somewhere else. I'd ask him about his day, and he'd mumble something vague, brushing off my questions with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. One evening, he told me he'd be late again, some after-work drinks with his new team. I decided to surprise him, thinking it'd be fun to show up, to meet the people he spent so much time with. I pictured myself slipping into the bar, tapping him on the shoulder, watching his face light up. But when I arrived, he wasn't there. I checked the address twice, thinking I must have gotten it wrong, but no, he just wasn't there. When he finally came home that night, I asked him about it, keeping my voice casual, hoping he'd have a good explanation. But he stammered, stumbled over his words in a way that didn't sit right. He said the plans had changed last minute, that he'd gone somewhere else, but he couldn't seem to remember where. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a small, sinking feeling that I tried to ignore. After that night, everything felt different. He was more guarded with his phone, keeping it close, silencing it whenever he was home. He'd stay up late, saying he had to catch up on work, sitting on the couch with his laptop and avoiding my gaze. I'd lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the distance between us grow, an invisible wall that I couldn't break through. One day, while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. I don't know what came over me, but I reached for it, a mixture of dread and curiosity clawing at me. I felt a rush of guilt, telling myself I was being paranoid, that I should just talk to him. But then I saw the message, a name I didn't recognize with a simple "Can't wait to see you tonight, Red Heart." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My hands shook as I put the phone back, my mind racing, trying to piece together every strange moment, every missed dinner, every guarded look. When he came out of the shower, I asked him point blank if there was someone else. For a moment, he looked panicked, caught, but then he tried to laugh it off, calling me crazy and paranoid. But the way he said it only made me more certain. That night, I barely slept, the truth sinking in no matter how much I wanted to deny it. I lay awake, my heart aching as I listened to him breathing beside me, the weight of his betrayal settling over me like a heavy fog. The next day, I didn't wait for him to come clean. I packed a bag, taking only the essentials, and left while he was still asleep. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there, couldn't keep pretending. I drove around aimlessly, ending up at a friend's house, where I finally broke down, telling her everything in a rush of tears and hurt and confusion. In the days that followed, he called, texted, left voicemails. He apologized, begged me to come back, promised it was just a mistake. But his words felt hollow, like an echo of the love I thought we'd had. I couldn't bring myself to answer, couldn't let myself fall back into something that was already broken beyond repair. I spent weeks grieving, mourning the life we'd built, the future I thought we'd share. Our apartment felt empty, haunted by memories that were now tinged with betrayal. I catch myself reaching for my phone to tell him something funny or sweet, only to remember that he wasn't the person I thought he was. It felt like I was losing pieces of myself, fragments of the life we'd shared, one memory at a time. But slowly, I began to heal. I surrounded myself with friends who reminded me who I was, who I'd been before him. I threw myself into work, into hobbies I'd neglected, rediscovering passions I'd put aside. I redecorated the apartment, painted the walls a new color, filled the space with things that felt like me, reclaiming every inch of it. One evening, months later, I ran into him by chance at a bookstore we used to go to together. He looked surprised, a little lost, as if he'd just realized what he'd thrown away. He started to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an attempt to make things right, but I stopped him. I didn't need his words, his explanations. I'd found my own closure, my own strength, and I wasn't willing to reopen old wounds. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of peace, a lightness I hadn't felt in ages. I'd loved him deeply, and losing him had been one of the hardest things I'd ever faced. But I'd survived, and in the process, I'd found myself again, stronger and wiser than before. Now, I carry the lessons with me, scars that remind me of my resilience, my worth. I know that I deserve a love that's honest, a love that doesn't hide behind closed doors or unanswered texts. And until I find it, I'm content, happy in the knowledge that I'm whole on my own, more than enough just as I am. I just finished work and was heading home when I saw the sign, a small wooden board painted in faded colors, hanging from a tree by the side of the road. It read, "The House of Lost Things. Open tonight only." An arrow pointed down a narrow, winding path that disappeared into the trees. I knew I should keep walking. It was late, I was tired, and the last thing I needed was some kind of strange detour. But something about that sign made me pause. I couldn't explain it, but I felt this pull, a quiet invitation that was impossible to ignore. So I turned down the path, the sound of the city fading as I walked deeper into the shadows of the trees. The path led to a small clearing, and there it was, the house. It looked like something out of a dream, or maybe a fairy tale. Old and crooked, its roof slanted at odd angles, with ivy winding up the sides. The windows glowed softly, casting a warm, inviting light into the night. A sign over the door read, in hand-carved letters, "House of Lost Things." I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of old books and a faint hint of lavender. The room was filled with shelves and cabinets, all crammed with objects of every kind. Books, toys, jewelry, even old keys and watches. There were things I recognized, things that looked strangely familiar, and things I'd never seen before. Everything was organized but haphazard, like someone had tried to impose order on chaos but had given up halfway. Behind the counter stood an older woman with silver hair and a calm, knowing smile. She looked up as I entered, her gaze warm and welcoming, as if she'd been expecting me. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft and soothing. "Welcome to the House of Lost Things." "Hi," I replied, glancing around the room. I saw the sign." She nodded. "Yes, tonight's a special night. We don't open often, but when we do, it's for a reason. People come here to find things they've lost, sometimes things they didn't even realize were missing." I blinked, unsure how to respond. Things they didn't realize were missing? She smiled, nodding slowly. "Yes, not just objects, but memories, feelings, connections. Sometimes people lose things that matter without ever noticing they're gone." I hesitated, taking in the room around me, feeling an odd sense of nostalgia. How do I find something here?" "Ah," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You don't. It finds you." With that, she gestured toward the shelves. "Take your time. When you're ready, the right thing will call to you." Feeling like I was in some kind of strange dream, I began to wander the aisles, my eyes drifting over the shelves. Each object seemed to hold a story, a memory. There was an old teddy bear missing one eye, a glass snow globe with a tiny town inside, a dusty leather-bound book with no title. Each item felt heavy with significance, like they were all quietly waiting to be remembered. After a few minutes, I stopped in front of a small, tarnished locket. It was silver, shaped like a heart, with intricate designs carved into the surface. I picked it up, feeling a strange familiarity as I held it in my hand. "You've found it," the woman said from behind me, her voice gentle. I turned to her, confused. I don't know why, but this feels like something I've seen before." She nodded, her expression understanding. "That locket belonged to someone in your family a long time ago. It was passed down generation to generation, but somewhere along the line, it was misplaced. Lost, waiting for someone to bring it home." I stared at the locket, my mind racing. My grandmother had always worn a locket, one just like this. She'd talk about it sometimes, about how it had been in the family for generations. But after she passed, the locket had disappeared, and no one knew what had happened to it. I looked at the woman, feeling a strange lump in my throat. "How did it end up here?" The woman gave me a sad smile. "Things find their way here when they're ready. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes lifetimes. But they wait until the right person comes along." I took a deep breath, clutching the locket tightly. It felt like I was holding a piece of my grandmother, like she was somehow close, as if by some strange magic. I'd been guided here to find this part of her again. What do I owe you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman shook her head. "Nothing at all. It was yours from the beginning, just waiting for you to return." I thanked her, slipping the locket into my pocket, and felt a weight lift from my heart, a quiet sense of completion, like I'd filled a space I hadn't realized was empty. As I turned to leave, the woman called out, her voice gentle but firm. "One more thing, James." I stopped, turning back to her surprised. "How do you know my name?" Her eyes sparkled, filled with that same knowing warmth. Some names stay with the things they've left behind, and some memories, they're just waiting for the right person to bring them back to life. I nodded, unable to find words, and stepped back outside, the door closing softly behind me. The house was dark now, its windows empty, its warm light gone as though it had vanished from existence. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, feeling disoriented, like I'd woken up from a dream. I walked back to my car, holding the locket in my hand. Under the light of the moon, I opened it, and inside was a tiny photograph, one I'd never seen before. It was a picture of my grandmother as a young woman, smiling, her eyes filled with that same warmth, that same quiet magic. And I knew, somehow, that she'd left this for me, a reminder that even things we think are lost forever have a way of finding their way back when the time is right. As I drove home, I felt a quiet peace settle over me, like I was carrying a piece of her with me, a part of her spirit guiding me. And I realized that sometimes the things we lose have a way of returning, not always as we expect, but just when we need them most. One winter evening, I decided to take a long, hot shower after a stressful day. I'd just come back from a late shift, feeling worn out, and the thought of standing under warm water for a few minutes was the only thing keeping me moving. I turned on the shower, let the water heat up, and stepped inside, closing my eyes as the steam filled the tiny bathroom. After a while, I started to feel lightheaded, which I brushed off as exhaustion. But as the minutes ticked by, the feeling intensified. My head felt heavy, my breathing became slow, and a strange dizziness settled over me. I reached out to steady myself on the wall, feeling a sudden jolt of alarm. Something didn't feel right. I pushed myself out of the shower, gripping the sink as I tried to catch my breath. The bathroom was thick with steam, the mirror fogged up so completely I could barely see my reflection. But it wasn't just steam. There was a faint metallic scent in the air, one that sent a chill through me. It was subtle, but the second I noticed it, I knew something was wrong. Feeling a surge of panic, I threw open the bathroom door, letting in fresh air from the hallway. The dizziness started to lift almost immediately, my head clearing with each breath. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that it wasn't exhaustion or the hot water making me lightheaded. It was carbon monoxide. My heart pounded as I rushed through the apartment, opening every window and door. I had no carbon monoxide detector in my bathroom and never would have thought to install one there. But with my old water heater running on natural gas, The enclosed space must have allowed gas to build up without me even noticing. I stood by the window, breathing deeply, realizing just how close I'd come to disaster. The next day, I bought a carbon monoxide detector and placed it right outside the bathroom door. I could barely sleep that night, thinking about all the silent risks I'd never considered, the things that could go wrong without any warning. It was chilling to realize how close I'd been to unknowingly putting myself in real danger. A few days later, I mentioned the experience to a friend, someone who lived in an older building like mine. She looked at me with wide eyes, her hand covering her mouth. "I've never even thought about that," she said. "I don't have a carbon monoxide detector either. I didn't think it was necessary." She bought one the next day, placing it near her own gas heater. The incident shifted something in me. I became more cautious, realizing that danger doesn't always come with obvious signs. I started checking everything in my apartment, making sure vents were clear, testing the smoke alarm, and being mindful of the exhaust from appliances. I even set a timer for showers, knowing now that staying in too long could have consequences beyond just running out of hot water. That close call made me see that safety isn't just about what we can see or hear. It's about the invisible threats that lurk in the quiet spaces of our homes. These days, every time I step into the shower or turn on the heater, I take a moment to double-check the detector to make sure the room is well ventilated. It's a small thing, but it's given me peace of mind. And every so often, I share the story with others. I tell them about that faint metallic smell, the dizziness that crept up on me in the steam, and the quiet danger of carbon monoxide. Some people brush it off, thinking it's just paranoia, but I know better now. I know that in the right, or rather wrong conditions, even something as simple as a hot shower can turn into a hazard. And it's that knowledge, that respect for the unseen risks, that helps keep me safe. This happened a couple of years ago, and I still can't get it out of my head. I don't know if I ever will. I just moved into a new place, a little studio apartment in an old building downtown. It was my first time living alone, and I was excited for the independence, the quiet. The building had a certain charm to it. Creaky floors, old radiators, high ceilings. Sure, it needed some work, but I thought the quirks made it feel lived in. It had character, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. The first few weeks were fine. I'd hear the usual sounds you'd expect from an old building. The radiator clanking, pipes rattling, the occasional muffled voice from one of the other units. But about a month in, I started noticing something odd. Every morning, I'd wake up and find my front door unlocked. I always locked it at night, without fail, and yet every morning, there it was unlocked, sometimes even cracked open an inch or two. I told myself I was probably just tired and forgetting to lock it, so I started double-checking before bed, giving the handle an extra tug to make sure it was secure. But no matter what I did, I'd wake up to find it unlocked again. Then one night, I decided to set up a camera by the door to catch myself in the act. I thought maybe I was sleepwalking, getting up in the middle of the night and unlocking it without realizing. It was the only explanation that made sense. I figured if I could just see myself doing it, I'd be able to fix it somehow. That night, I set the camera up on a chair, pointed it at the door, hit record, and went to bed, feeling almost foolish for taking it so seriously. But I needed the peace of mind. The next morning, as expected, the door was unlocked. My heart sank, but I forced myself to check the camera, expecting to see footage of myself sleepwalking, maybe mumbling to myself as I unlocked the door. But what I saw made my blood run cold. Around 3 a.m., the camera showed me asleep in bed, the room dimly lit by the streetlight outside. Then slowly, the door handle began to turn. The door opened quietly, almost gently, and a dark figure slipped inside. I watched, horrified, as the figure moved through my apartment, its movements slow and deliberate. It was tall, its face obscured in shadow, and it seemed to linger by my bed, watching me. After a few minutes, it backed away, quietly unlocking the door and slipping back out into the hallway, leaving the door cracked open behind it. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Someone had been coming into my apartment while I was asleep, standing over me, watching me, then leaving without a trace. I called the building manager, shaking as I tried to explain what I'd seen. He seemed shocked, promised he'd change the locks right away, assured me that no one else had a key to my apartment. I wanted to believe him, but after seeing that footage, I didn't feel safe anymore. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound, every creak. The new lock seemed to work, at least for a few days. I started to relax, telling myself it was over, that maybe whoever it was had just been some drifter who'd found an old spare key. But one night, just as I was beginning to feel safe again, I heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of my doorknob rattling. I froze, my heart pounding, staring at the door from across the room. I'd wedged a chair under the doorknob as an extra precaution, and as I watched, I saw the doorknob turn slowly, almost as if someone on the other side was testing it, waiting for a reaction. And then, I heard a voice, soft and raspy, barely more than a whisper. "Let me in." I backed away, pressing myself against the far wall, feeling trapped, my mind racing. I wanted to call the police, scream, do something, but I was too afraid to make a sound. I could see the shadow under the door, the faint outline of someone standing just on the other side. The handle rattled again, harder this time, and I heard the voice again, more insistent, more desperate. "Let me in." I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, listening to that voice. Eventually, the rattling stopped, and the shadow disappeared from under the door. I waited, barely daring to breathe, until I was sure whoever it was had gone. The next morning, I went to the building manager again, demanded to know if he'd really changed the locks, if anyone else had a key. He swore up and down that he had, but the way he looked at me, I could tell he thought I was losing it. And maybe I was, but I knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. I started sleeping with the lights on, barely getting a few hours each night, jumping at every sound. I couldn't eat, couldn't focus. I felt like a prisoner in my own apartment, constantly on edge, waiting for that rattling at the door. A week later, I came home from work to find something on the floor just inside my door. It was a folded piece of paper, old and yellowed, with a single sentence scrawled in uneven handwriting. "You can't keep me out forever." I left that night, packed a bag, locked the door behind me, and never went back. I broke the lease, lost my deposit, and moved in with a friend across town. I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that apartment as possible. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I still think I can hear it. The faint, slow turn of a doorknob, the soft, insistent whisper just beyond the door. "Let me in." I've never told anyone what happened last fall. I've gone over it in my mind 1,000 times, wondering if there was something I missed, some clue I overlooked that would make it make sense. But every time I think about it, it just makes me feel colder. At the time, I was working for a small moving company. It was hard work, but I liked the routine of it. Packing things up, moving them out, unpacking them somewhere new. It felt like you were helping people start fresh, in a way. We do everything from small apartments to sprawling old houses out in the countryside, and some places were more memorable than others. One afternoon, we got a call from a woman named Mrs. Booker. She said she needed help clearing out her mother's house, and that she was on a tight deadline because the house had been sold and needed to be emptied by the weekend. She sounded strained on the phone, almost desperate, and she asked if we could come the next day. My boss agreed, and I was assigned to the job along with another guy, Ray, who had been with the company for years. The house was on the outskirts of town, at the end of a narrow, winding road. It looked like it had once been grand, a big, old Victorian with intricate woodwork and a wide porch. But the paint was peeling, the windows were dusty, and the whole place had this abandoned, forgotten look to it. Mrs. Booker was waiting for us on the front steps when we arrived. She was a tall, thin woman in her late 40s, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. She gave us a quick tour of the house, explaining what needed to go and what should stay. She told us that most of the furniture and belongings were being donated or thrown out, and she only wanted to keep a few things: some family photos, a couple of heirlooms, and a box she'd left in the attic. She was oddly specific about the box, repeating several times that it was the only thing she absolutely needed us to bring down carefully. She barely looked at us as she spoke, her eyes darting around the house as if she was afraid of something. And then, as she was leaving, she looked at me, her eyes wide and almost pleading, and said, "Don't stay after dark. Just finish up and go." The warning felt strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Old houses have their quirks, and I figured she was just sentimental or maybe a little superstitious. Ray and I got to work moving out boxes of old clothes, furniture covered in sheets, stacks of dusty books. The whole place smelled like mildew and something else I couldn't place. Something stale, almost metallic. By mid-afternoon, the light outside had started to fade, and I realized we'd be cutting it close to finish before nightfall. I was carrying a stack of boxes out to the truck when I heard Ray calling for me from the attic. "I found the box!" he shouted, his voice muffled. I climbed the narrow stairs up to the attic, feeling the air grow colder with every step. The attic was dim, with only a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Ray was standing by an old trunk, holding a small, wooden box with a brass latch. It looked old, worn, like it had been handled a lot over the years. "Is this the one she wanted?" Ray asked, turning the box over in his hands. I nodded. "Yeah, she said it was the only thing she needed us to bring down." We were about to leave when Ray hesitated, his gaze fixed on the box. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I listened, and at first I didn't hear anything. But then faintly I caught it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the attic. It was slow, steady, like someone tapping their fingernails against wood. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the house settling. "Let's just get out of here," I said a little more urgently than I meant to. Ray nodded, but he seemed reluctant to leave, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for something. We made our way down the stairs, but the tapping followed us, growing louder and faster. By the time we reached the main floor, it had become this frantic, desperate sound, like someone was pounding on the walls. Ray and I exchanged a nervous glance, both of us feeling the weight of the house pressing in around us. We packed up as fast as we could, loading the last few boxes into the truck. Just as we were about to leave, I realized we'd forgotten to lock the front door. I told Ray to wait while I ran back to lock up, not wanting to leave the place open overnight. The house was dead silent as I stepped inside, and for a moment, I almost thought I'd imagined the tapping. But as I crossed the living room, I heard it again, a soft, frantic sound coming from the attic, like something or someone was trapped up there. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to go back up to see if there was something I'd missed. The air grew colder as I climbed the stairs, and by the time I reached the attic, I could barely feel my fingers. The room was dark, the single bulb casting long, flickering shadows across the floor. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, there was something, a small, dark shape curled up, motionless. It looked almost like a person, but the proportions were wrong, the limbs too thin, too long. I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my foot hit something on the floor, and I glanced down. There, scattered across the attic floor, were dozens of old photographs, all faded and yellowed with age. They were all of the same woman, a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, standing in different parts of the house. In each photo, she was alone, staring at the camera with this hollow, empty look in her eyes. And then I realized she was standing in the exact same spot as the dark shape in the corner. I didn't stop to think. I ran down the stairs, out the front door, and into the truck, barely able to catch my breath. Ray looked at me, alarmed, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. I just told him to drive, to get us as far from that house as possible. We drove in silence, the road stretching out into the dark, and I thought about the photos, about the strange figure in the corner of the attic. I thought about the tapping, that desperate, insistent sound that had followed us all the way down. The next day, Mrs. Booker called to thank us, and I asked her, as casually as I could, about the box. She hesitated, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "That was my sister's," she said. "She disappeared when we were kids. They never found her. My mother kept that box all these years, said it was the only thing left of her." I hung up, feeling that same cold chill run down my spine. I don't know what I saw in that attic, and I don't want to know. But sometimes late at night, I hear that sound again, the soft, insistent tapping like someone trying to find their way back. And I wonder if whatever was in that house is still there, waiting, just out of sight. I still can't make sense of it. I don't know if I ever will, but maybe putting it down will stop it from haunting me, at least for a while. I don't know where to begin except to say that I don't scare easily. But what happened on that night, what I saw, what I heard, there's no easy way to explain it or to forget it. It started when I took a gig on a ghost hunting app. I'd signed up as a joke with my friend Nate. We figured we'd get a few laughs out of it, maybe make a couple of bucks. It was mostly people asking for help with creaky old houses or weird sounds in their basements. Nothing serious. But one evening, I got a request from a guy named Darren who lived way out in the country, at the end of a winding dirt road surrounded by dense woods. He was offering triple the usual rate for a consultation that night, claiming he'd been seeing things, hearing things, that he was desperate for help. It was already getting late, and I was about to pass on it. But Nate egged me on, saying it would be an easy gig. Show up, do some ghost hunting theatrics, cash in, and leave. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We grabbed our flashlights, a cheap EMF meter, and a few other tools we didn't know how to use, hopped in my car, and drove out. When we pulled up, the place looked like something out of a horror movie. The house was old, crumbling, with paint peeling off in huge flakes and windows that looked like empty, staring eyes. There was no sign of life. No lights on, no car in the driveway, nothing to suggest anyone was home. For a moment, I thought maybe we'd been pranked, that no one actually lived here. But as we got out of the car, we saw a figure standing just inside the front door, watching us. Darren, I called out, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, a silhouette in the dim light, and waved us inside. Reluctantly, we went in. The house smelled like mold and old wood, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. Darren didn't say a word, just motioned for us to follow him down a narrow hallway, his footsteps eerily silent on the creaky floorboards. Nate and I exchanged uneasy glances but followed him into a small, dimly lit room. The room was empty, except for an old, wooden chair in the center and a large mirror on the wall. One of those antique mirrors with dark, ornate carvings along the frame. It was cracked down the middle, and even in the low light, I could see my own reflection split in two, like there were two of me staring back. Darren finally spoke, his voice low and shaky. "She's in there," he whispered, gesturing toward the mirror. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She used to be here with me. She was my fiancée. But something happened, something I can't explain." He swallowed, his eyes wide and hollow, fixed on the mirror. "She's still here, but not how she used to be." I glanced at Nate, expecting him to make a joke or laugh it off. But he just stood there, staring at the mirror, his face pale. I took out the EMF meter, partly to break the tension, but the second I turned it on, it started spiking, the needle jumping wildly. "Is this thing broken?" I muttered, tapping it, but the needle kept twitching erratically. That's when Darren looked at me, his expression almost desperate. "Don't turn your back to it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She doesn't like it when people look away." I laughed nervously, thinking he was just trying to scare us, but the look in his eyes was so intense, so terrified, that I felt my stomach drop. I turned back to the mirror, feeling like a fool, but as I stared into it, I saw something. Just a flicker at first, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, shifting behind my reflection. I blinked, convinced I was imagining things, but the shadow was still there, darker now, taking shape. It was a woman's face, pale, with wide, empty eyes and a faint, twisted smile that sent a chill down my spine. She was looking directly at me, her gaze cold and unblinking, as if she'd been waiting for me to notice her. "Nate, do you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. When I glanced over, he was standing rigid, his eyes fixed on the mirror, his face blank, almost as if he were in a trance. I reached out to shake his shoulder, but he didn't move, didn't blink, just kept staring at the mirror like he was hypnotized. "Hey, Nate," I said louder, trying to snap him out of it. But before I could touch him, Darren grabbed my arm, his grip ice cold. "Don't," he said, his voice filled with a strange intensity. "She's got him. She always takes one." I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron, holding me in place. "What the hell are you talking about?" I demanded, panic creeping into my voice. "She always takes one," he repeated, his eyes fixed on the mirror, a strange, resigned look on his face. "One to keep her company, to keep her from coming back for the rest of us." I looked back at the mirror, and that's when I saw it. Nate's reflection was wrong. His face was pale, his eyes wide and empty, staring blankly back at me. And behind him, the woman's face was clearer, her smile wider, her hand resting on his shoulder, like she was claiming him, pulling him toward her. I shouted his name, trying to break whatever hold she had on him, but he didn't move, didn't even blink. And then, slowly, he started to walk toward the mirror, as if he were being drawn in, his body moving against his will. I tried to grab him, to pull him back, but Darren held me tight, his grip like a vice. "You can't save him," he said, his voice hollow. "Once she's chosen, it's over. Let go of me." I screamed, struggling against him, but he held firm, his face expressionless, almost as if he were relieved. I watched, helpless, as Nate reached the mirror, his hand lifting, pressing against the glass. The woman's hand met his from the other side, her fingers long and thin, stretching impossibly far. And then, slowly, she began to pull him in. His reflection wavered, distorting, until it looked like he was sinking into the glass, merging with her, his eyes wide with horror as he disappeared into the darkness behind her. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, watching as the mirror went dark, the crack in the glass widening until it looked like a gaping maw, swallowing him whole. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. The mirror was empty, just my own reflection staring back at me, pale and terrified. Darren finally let go, stepping back, his expression distant, almost sad. "She's gone now," he said quietly. "She has what she wanted." I turned to him, my fists clenched, rage and grief flooding me. "What did you do? Why didn't you stop her?" He looked at me with that same empty expression. "It's the only way. She needed someone, and it wasn't going to be me." I stumbled back, horrified, unable to process what had just happened. Without another word, I turned and ran, leaving him alone in that cursed house, with that cursed mirror. I don't remember the drive home, just the sound of my own breathing, ragged and desperate, as I tried to block out the image of Nate's face, his eyes pleading as he was pulled into the glass. I've tried to forget, to convince myself it was all some nightmare. But sometimes, late at night, I feel that same cold grip, like someone's hand on my shoulder, pulling me back toward that mirror, that woman's twisted smile waiting for me in the dark. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I swear I can see Nate, just a faint outline, a shadow, his eyes still wide and pleading, trapped on the other side, waiting for me to let him out. I'm a paramedic, working the night shift in a city where things get dark fast. I've handled everything from gunshot wounds to OD cases to people in the worst kinds of pain. The job makes you numb. In a way, you learn to push through, to stay calm, to let it roll off you when you can. But sometimes, a call gets to you, and it sticks with you in ways you can't explain. It was a Tuesday night, just after midnight, when we got a call about an unresponsive male, possible overdose. Pretty typical on a weeknight, so my partner and I geared up and headed over. The location was in an industrial part of town. A few blocks of empty warehouses and offices, quiet except for the occasional passing truck. When we pulled up, the only sign of life was a single street light flickering overhead. The caller, a middle-aged man, flagged us down, his face pale. He pointed us toward a narrow alley, mumbling that he'd found the guy there while walking his dog. He didn't stick around, just turned and left in a hurry. Right away, that felt strange, but we were more focused on the patient than the bystander. As we walked down the alley, we spotted him. A young man, early 20s, slumped against the wall, head tilted forward, one arm stretched out beside him. He looked like he'd been there for hours. His clothes were dusty, his skin pale, and his breathing was shallow. I knelt down, feeling for a pulse, and my partner shone a light on his face. That's when I noticed the look in his eyes. They were wide open, unfocused, staring past me like he was seeing something far off. I called his name, trying to get him to respond, but he didn't blink. He didn't react to my voice or to the light. He just sat there, breathing in these shallow gasps, his mouth barely moving. I thought maybe he was in shock, maybe he'd been hurt or seen something traumatic. But there were no visible injuries, no bruises, no signs of a struggle. As we lifted him onto the stretcher, his hands suddenly shot out, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. His grip was icy, and he pulled me close, his eyes locking onto mine with a desperation I hadn't expected. Don't let them take me back," he whispered, his voice barely a rasp. I asked him what he meant, who he thought was trying to take him, but he just shook his head, his eyes darting around like he was looking for something in the shadows. "They found me. I thought I'd gotten away," he murmured, his grip tightening on my arm. "Please, you don't know what they do to you down there." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I'd seen people ramble incoherently before, people under the influence or in shock, but something about this felt different. There was a clarity in his fear, an intensity that made me feel like I was missing something vital. We managed to get him into the ambulance, but he wouldn't stop shaking, his eyes never once closing, never relaxing. My partner looked over at me, his expression uneasy, and we shared a silent acknowledgement that this was unlike anything we'd dealt with before. As we started driving, I tried to ask him questions, simple things, his name, where he was from, if he had anyone we could call. He only shook his head, repeating the same words over and over. "I can't go back. I can't go back." I tried to reassure him, telling him he was safe with us, that no one was going to hurt him. But his gaze just drifted past me, unfocused, as he mumbled, "You don't understand. They're not done yet." His voice was almost a whimper, like he was pleading with me to believe him. When we arrived at the ER, he seemed more panicked than ever, his breathing fast and shallow, his body tense like he was ready to fight. It took both of us to help him out of the ambulance and onto a gurney, and he kept trying to twist around, looking back toward the alley as if he expected something, or someone, to follow. The nurses took over, bringing him into an exam room, while my partner and I finished up the paperwork. Just as we were wrapping up, one of the ER nurses came out, looking unsettled. She said he'd started to calm down, but wouldn't let go of her hand, repeating, "Don't leave me. Don't let them in." She asked him who he meant, but he wouldn't answer, only started crying, muttering about the basement and the shadows. She tried to get him to explain, but he just broke down, staring off like he was somewhere far away. We handed over the report and were just about to leave when the lights in the hallway flickered. It happens sometimes in old hospitals, but in that moment, everyone fell silent. It was like a wave of tension washed over the room, leaving us all feeling uneasy. I glanced down the hall toward the exam room where they'd taken him, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move across the glass window of the door. Just a trick of the light, I told myself, but something about it made my skin crawl. That was the last I saw of him. We headed back out, picking up another call shortly after, and by the time our shift ended, I'd almost put it out of my mind. But a week later, I heard from one of the nurses that he'd vanished from the hospital. Just got up, ripped out his four, and walked out barefoot in the middle of the night. No one saw him leave, and the cameras at the entrance hadn't caught him. He was just gone. A month later, we were called to the same area for another unresponsive man found in an alley. Different guy, similar age, same gaunt, hollow look. When we got to him, he was lying on the ground, eyes open, staring up at the sky, not blinking, not moving. When I knelt down to check his pulse, he suddenly grabbed my arm, his eyes locking onto mine with a fear I recognized all too well. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't let them take me back. They're still there." I'm not sure I'll ever fully process what happened last summer. It's something I can't shake, no matter how hard I try. I was doing overnight work as a groundskeeper at a large cemetery just outside of town. The hours were long, and the work wasn't exactly thrilling, but the pay was decent, and it gave me plenty of time to be alone. There were usually a few maintenance tasks to handle each night. Fixing fences, cleaning the pathways, minor landscaping. But mostly, it was just me, the silence, and endless rows of gravestones stretching into the dark. The first few weeks were quiet. Most nights, I'd wander the grounds with a flashlight, taking my time. It's funny, you'd think a graveyard would feel eerie at night, but after a while, it just felt empty. Just quiet, still, like the whole place was holding its breath. I even started to enjoy the solitude. That was until one night in late August when I noticed something strange. It was around 2 a.m., and I was doing my usual rounds when I saw it. A single gravestone near the edge of the cemetery, tilted to the side. It was an older headstone, worn and hard to read in the dim light, with vines creeping up from the ground, as if they were trying to swallow it whole. I'd never seen it before, which was strange. I'd walked those rows 100 times, and I thought I knew every marker by heart. Curious, I moved closer, shining my flashlight over the stone. It was barely legible, but I could make out a name, Evelyn Markham, and below it, the year, 1923. No birth date, no other information, just her name and the year. As I stood there, studying the stone, I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. It was the middle of a warm summer night, but the air around me felt ice cold, almost stinging. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just the wind, and went on with my rounds, trying to shake the feeling. The next night, the gravestone was there again, but this time, it was standing upright, looking newer somehow, like someone had polished it. I remember staring at it, feeling this strange sense of dread wash over me. I'd heard stories, of course, superstitions about haunted graves and spirits wandering in places like this, but I'd never put any stock in them. And yet, there was something about that headstone, something that made me feel like I wasn't alone. A few nights later, I was clearing some overgrown bushes near the same area when I heard a noise, a faint rustling, like someone walking through the tall grass. I turned, expecting to see an animal, maybe a stray dog, but there was no one there. Just the empty field and the rows of gravestones stretching into the dark. But as I shone my flashlight over the area, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt, right in front of Evelyn's gravestone, were footprints bare small, like those of a child. They led away from the stone and disappeared into the grass. I backed away, my heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe some kid had snuck into the cemetery earlier in the day. Maybe the footprints were just an illusion, something caused by the shadows. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Over the next week, things only got stranger. I'd hear things, soft whispers carried on the wind, just faint enough that I couldn't make out the words. Sometimes, as I walked the grounds, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the stones, gone as quickly as it appeared. And always, I'd end up back at Evelyn's grave, drawn to it by some invisible pull. One night, as I was walking past her headstone, I noticed something lying on the ground, a small, tattered ribbon, half buried in the dirt. It looked old, the kind of thing you'd see in an antique store, worn and faded. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, and for a moment I felt this overwhelming sadness, like a wave crashing over me. It was so intense that I had to sit down, my hands trembling. And then I heard it, a faint, childlike voice, drifting through the air. It was soft, barely a whisper, but I could hear the words as clear as day. "Please help me." I dropped the ribbon, stumbling back, my heart racing. The voice faded, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence of the graveyard. I wanted to run, to leave and never come back, but I was frozen in place, unable to move, the words echoing in my mind. I forced myself to leave the area, to finish my rounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I barely slept, lying in bed with the words running over and over in my head. The next night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this keep haunting me. I decided to do some research, to see if I could find anything about Evelyn Markham. Maybe if I knew more about her, it would give me some closure, some way to explain what was happening. I spent the next day at the library, digging through old records, archives, anything I could find. After hours of searching, I finally found something, a newspaper article from 1923. It was a small piece, almost an afterthought in the back pages, but it caught my eye. "Local girl, Evelyn Markham, 8 goes missing," it read. According to the article, she had vanished from her home one summer night, last seen playing in her backyard. Despite a thorough search, no trace of her was ever found, and she was eventually presumed dead. Her parents had placed a small memorial stone for her in the cemetery, but her body was never recovered. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been standing over a memorial, not a grave. Evelyn had never been found. She'd been lost, forgotten, her story buried and left to fade with time. That night, as I walked the cemetery, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt before. I went back to Evelyn Stone, standing there in the moonlight, feeling the weight of her presence around me. I whispered, "I know what happened. I am sorry." For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I felt a warmth, a gentle, soft warmth that wrapped around me like a hug. It was comforting, almost reassuring, and for the first time, I felt at peace. After that night, the strange occurrences stopped. I didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the shadows darting between the gravestones. Evelyn Stone looked different, too. Still weathered, still worn, but somehow more settled, like a part of the earth around it. I still work at the cemetery, still walk those same paths every night. But now, when I pass by Evelyn Stone, I leave a small flower, just something simple to remind her that she's not forgotten. And sometimes, when the wind is still and the night is quiet, I feel that same warmth again, like she's there, watching, waiting at peace. I haven't told anyone this. I've barely even let myself think about it. But every night it creeps back into my mind, like it's been waiting for me to confront it. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it. Or maybe it'll just confirm what I'm starting to suspect, that I'm not the only one carrying this thing with me. It started with a phone call I got late one night. I'd been working overtime shifts, barely keeping my eyes open as I got home and fell into bed. It was past midnight, and I was exhausted, so I didn't pick up. When I checked the call log later, I saw the number was unfamiliar, no caller ID, just a bunch of zeros. I figured it was a scam or some automated message, and I forgot about it. But then it called again the next night at the exact same time, and again the night after that. I finally answered on the third night, annoyed and ready to give whoever it was a piece of my mind. But when I picked up, there was only silence on the other end, heavy and oppressive, like someone was there listening. I waited, about to hang up, when a voice whispered, so quiet I almost missed it. "Why didn't you help me?" I froze, my blood running cold. It sounded like a woman's voice, faint and distant, like it was coming from miles away. I tried to speak, to ask who it was, but my throat went dry. After a few seconds, the line went dead. I tried to shake it off as some kind of prank, maybe a wrong number, but it stuck with me, worming its way into my thoughts. I couldn't figure out who it could have been. The voice didn't sound familiar, but there was something about it, a tone of desperation, of grief, that made it feel personal. The calls kept coming, every night, each time at exactly 12:15 a.m. I stopped answering after a while, letting it go to voicemail, but there was never a message. Just that same hollow silence. And every time, I'd stare at the phone, feeling that same creeping dread, that horrible feeling that someone, somewhere, was reaching out to me, waiting. After a week, the calls stopped. I remember feeling relieved, like a weight had been lifted. I went to bed early that night, telling myself it was over, that it was just some freak thing. But at exactly 12:15, I woke up to the sound of my phone ringing. I didn't want to answer. Every part of me was screaming not to. But something made me pick up, almost like I didn't have a choice. I held the phone to my ear, not saying anything, just listening. There was that same silence, but this time it was heavier, almost suffocating, like something was pressing down on me, holding me in place. And then I heard it again, that faint, whispering voice. "Why didn't you help me?" The question twisted something deep inside me, dredging up memories I hadn't thought about in years. There was only one person I could think of who'd ask me that, but it wasn't possible. She was gone. Her name was Emily. We'd met in college, been close friends until she moved away, and we drifted apart. I hadn't thought about her in a long time. Not since the night I'd found out the news had hit me hard. She'd been struggling, and I'd known that, but I hadn't done enough. I'd missed her calls that week, too busy with my own life to check in. And then she was gone, just like that, leaving behind this gnawing guilt that I'd never been able to shake. But it couldn't be her. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, some glitch, maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But every night, I'd get that same call, and every night, I'd hear her voice, growing louder, more insistent, the words sinking deeper under my skin. "Why didn't you help me?" After a month of sleepless nights, I finally broke down. I tried talking to the voice, answering her. I'd sit there, whispering into the phone, trying to explain myself, trying to apologize, but there was never a response, just that same question, repeated over and over. One night, after another sleepless night haunted by that voice, I fell asleep in the early hours of the morning. And that's when the dream started. I was back in my old college dorm, the halls empty and dark, the air thick with that same suffocating silence. I'd walk through the corridors, hearing footsteps behind me, the faint, echoing sounds of someone calling my name, growing closer and closer. Then I'd see her, just a glimpse at first, a figure at the end of the hall, her back to me, her hair hanging over her face, her shoulders slumped. Every night, I'd follow her, calling her name, trying to reach her, but she'd always slip away, disappearing around corners, leading me deeper and deeper into that dark, endless maze. And every night, she'd get a little closer. Her footsteps would grow louder, her whispers clearer, until I could almost feel her breath on the back of my neck, her fingers brushing my shoulder as she whispered, "Why didn't you help me?" One night, I woke up and found myself standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, my phone in my hand, the call still connected, though I had no memory of answering it. I looked down at the screen, and my stomach dropped. The call had been going on for over an hour, and I hadn't heard a word. That's when I noticed something strange. My phone's screen was dim, barely lit, but in the reflection, I could see her. Emily, standing right behind me, her face pale, her eyes dark and empty, staring at me with that same hollow expression. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just an empty, silent hallway. I didn't sleep for days after that, terrified that if I closed my eyes, she'd be waiting for me, pulling me back into that dark maze. I stopped answering the calls, but every night they kept coming, the same unending silence, the same invisible weight pressing down on me, like she was waiting for me to acknowledge her. Then, one night, the call came through again, but this time, I didn't hear her voice. Instead, there was this static like a faint hissing sound. I almost hung up, but something made me keep listening, leaning closer to the phone, straining to make out what was on the other end. And then, in the middle of the static, I heard it. Her voice, broken and distorted, barely audible, but unmistakable. "It's cold here. So dark. I need you to come with me." My skin went ice cold. I dropped the phone, backing away like it was a venomous snake. I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat in my living room, lights blazing, every shadow in the room twisting into her shape, her voice echoing in my mind. For weeks, the call stopped. I thought it was over, that maybe she'd moved on, but part of me knew better. And then last night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, just about to drift off, when my phone lit up. I didn't need to look at the caller ID to know who it was. Hands shaking, I picked it up, held it to my ear, and waited. The silence stretched on, longer than ever, heavy and expectant. And then finally, she spoke. "I'm here." My blood ran cold, and I glanced around the room, feeling like she was watching me, standing just beyond the edge of the darkness, waiting. I whispered her name, my voice barely a breath, and for a moment, there was no answer. But then, in that same faint, broken voice, she replied, "I'm here, just open the door." I froze, every nerve screaming at me to hang up, to run. But before I could do anything, I heard a soft, faint knock from the other side of my bedroom door. 3 slow, steady knocks like someone was waiting just a few feet away. I haven't slept since. I can still feel her there, just outside, waiting for me to open the door, to let her in. And every night, at exactly 12:15 a.m., I hear her voice, soft and broken, coming through the phone. "I'm here, open the door." I've been an ER nurse for over a decade now, working the night shift in a hospital that sees its fair share of strange cases. I've dealt with every kind of emergency you can imagine, from the routine to the horrific. But sometimes, the things you see don't make sense. And when you're already exhausted and a little numb from the job, that's when the truly unsettling stuff seems to creep in. This happened a few months back. It was a slow night, unusually quiet, with only a couple of minor injuries coming through. Just after 2 a.m., a man walked into the ER. He was in his 30s, tall, gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes, wearing a worn-out coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. But what caught my attention wasn't his appearance. It was the look on his face. Utter terror, like he'd just seen something he couldn't explain. He walked up to the front desk, hands shaking, and asked if he could speak to a doctor. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes darting around the waiting area. When the receptionist asked him what was wrong, he just said, "I don't feel safe. I think something's wrong with me." She looked over at me, and I went to bring him into one of the exam rooms to figure out what was going on. As we walked down the hallway, I asked if he was hurt, if he'd been in an accident, or if he was having any kind of medical emergency. He shook his head but wouldn't say much, just mumbled that he'd been on the run and hadn't slept in days. When I asked him who he was running from, he went quiet, his face tightening with fear. We got to an empty exam room, and I sat him down trying to get him to talk. He was fidgety, his leg bouncing as he looked around the room like he expected someone to come bursting through the door. He glanced at me, his eyes wide, and said, "I know this sounds crazy, but I don't think I'm alone anymore. There's something that keeps following me." I asked him to explain, but he just shook his head, hands gripping the edges of the exam table until his knuckles turned white. "It's been like this for weeks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be sitting somewhere, and suddenly, I'll feel like I'm being watched. But it's worse than that. It's like something's right there, just waiting for me to see it." He stopped talking, staring at the far corner of the room, his whole body tense. I'd seen patients dealing with paranoia and hallucinations before, so I tried to reassure him, tell him he was safe here, and that we'd get him some help. But he wouldn't look away from the corner. "You don't get it," he said, his voice shaking. "It's here with me. It's always here." I took his vitals, which were surprisingly normal given his agitated state. I asked if he'd taken any drugs or if he had a history of mental health issues, but he insisted he hadn't. He was just terrified, like something had pushed him to the edge. I asked him if he had any family or friends we could call, anyone who could come and help him, but he shook his head. At that point, one of the doctors came in, and I stepped out to let him do the consult, thinking that was the end of it. I went back to the nurse's station, trying to push the encounter out of my mind, chalking it up to stress or sleep deprivation. But about 15 minutes later, I heard a commotion coming from the exam room. A nurse ran over, looking panicked, and said, "You need to see this." I followed her back to the room, and when I got there, I saw the man standing in the middle of the room, staring at his own reflection in the glass cabinet door. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and he was breathing in these shallow, rapid gasps. The doctor was trying to calm him down, but the man just kept staring at his reflection, whispering, "It's behind me. It's right behind me." We tried to get him to lie back down, to talk to us, but he suddenly turned, his hands gripping his head, and let out this guttural scream that sent chills down my spine. He backed himself into the corner of the room, curling up, muttering to himself, "I can't let it get me. I can't let it take me back." Eventually, we managed to sedate him, and he fell into a fitful sleep. The doctor ordered a psych eval, and we moved him to one of the observation rooms to wait for a specialist to come and assess him. I thought that would be the end of it, that he'd get some help, maybe find some peace. But later that night, just as my shift was ending, I walked past the observation room to check on him one last time. I glanced through the window, and my stomach dropped. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, awake, his back turned to the door, staring at the wall. I went in quietly, not wanting to startle him, but as I got closer, I realized he was muttering to himself, his voice barely a whisper. "They're here. They're waiting. They never really leave." I felt a chill, but I asked him if he was okay, if there was anything he needed. He didn't turn around. He just kept staring at the wall, his breathing shallow, as if he was bracing himself for something. Then, in the same monotone, he said, "You should go. They don't like it when people interfere." I took a step back, feeling a strange sense of dread, like I was standing too close to something dangerous. I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't want to find out. I left the room, closing the door quietly behind me, telling myself it was just another night, just another patient lost in their own fears. The next morning, I checked his file, hoping for some update, but he was gone. Discharged himself, signed the papers, and walked out. No one knew where he went. I asked a few of the nurses if they'd seen him leave, but no one had. It was like he'd vanished. Since that night, I sometimes catch myself glancing at the corners of the rooms, half expecting to see something there, something I can't quite name. The other nurses joke that I've been working too many night shifts, that I'm starting to see things. But I can't shake the feeling that, somewhere out there, he's still running, still looking over his shoulder, convinced that whatever he was afraid of hasn't let him go.